So when we first open Blender, we have a cube in the middle, a lamp, and a camera. If we select the cube, we can't really do much about it, and that's because we need to activate the tool for moving. So if you go on the left hand side, we have our toolbar here with a series of options. We can hover over and we get a little pop-up that tells us exactly what that tool does. So if we want to move it, we select the move tool and we have this gizmo now available for us. So if I click and hold and I type a number, let's type 2, I just moved it 2 units, 2 meters, feet or inches in one direction. Control Z or Command Z to undo and we return it back to where it was. We can do a similar thing with rotate, so we can pick a specific axis and then click, hold, and type. Let's type 15, undo, and scale. We can scale individually, or if we click the white arrow, we can scale in all directions. And we can type 2, and now we've scaled. Or we can do a multiple transform. And we have all 3 gizmos now available to us. We have scale, we have move, and we have rotate. So let's move this cube out of the way. And let's add a new object. To add a new object, we go here in the upper menu and click Add. And let's select Mesh. And here we have plane and cube. For the most part, we'll be working with planes and cubes to start with. So let's add a cube. And as you can see, it goes in the center of our scene right now. If I move that cube out of the way, and now let's click on this cursor tool, and that moves this cursor here. So let's put the cursor somewhere over there. And now if we go to Add, Mesh, Cube, and you see it puts the cube where the cursor is located. So the cursor is something specific to Blender, but it tends to be quite useful for moving things and snapping things around. To put the cursor back in the center of the scene, we'll go to Object, Snap, Cursor to World Origin. Now let's see what other kinds of objects we can add. So if you go to Add, Mesh, and let's add a plane. And now let's see if we can scale it to 4. To move around our scene, we use the middle mouse button or shift middle mouse button to pan, and we scroll up and down to zoom. Okay, now let's get rid of all these objects. So I'll select this tool here, which is select box, click and hold to draw a rectangle. With everything selected, we can press the delete key. And now let's add a new box. Add, mesh, cube. Now we'll add a couple of modifiers. So let's go here in the properties, click on the tool wrench, add modifier, and let's add array. Let's change the relative offset to 1.2 and change the count to 10. And zoom out to see everything. Let's add another modifier. It will be another array, and this time we'll change the x factor to 0 and the y factor to 1.2. And now let's change the count to 10. And now we have a grid. If we change the count of these arrays, we can easily change the number of objects that we have in our field. As you can see, the number of modifiers is quite extensive, so we'll focus on the ones and gradually introduce them. So with our object now, it's still a single object, by the way. So if we try to move it around, let's click on the move tool, and you see that everything moves in response. So I'm going to press now escape to exit out. Now let's look at some simple materials as well. Let's click on the material preview mode, which is here. And now let's go to the material properties, which is this red button near the bottom. Let's click on new, and let's name the material metal. So in surface, we want to change the base color to something darker. And metallic, let's make it +1. And we can leave everything else as is. So now we've added a sort of metallic color. So if we turn down the roughness, it will become more transparent. Now over here in the settings for the material preview node, if you click and hold here, we can change the different kind of HDRIs that we have available to us. So if we click, we have a series of different ones. So let's try this one here, for example. And you see, because we have a lot of reflections of our object, it tends to look a little bit different. Within this menu here, we can also rotate our world. In this case, it doesn't do a lot, but let's change a different world here. Let's go to this one. And if we rotate it, you can see the tree reflections sort of rotate as well. Okay, now with the basics out of the way, let's go ahead and really have a thorough walkthrough to all the elements that are important in our workflow with Blender. So that includes the user interface and some preferences and some necessary add-ons to be able to work efficiently within Blender. So the first thing I want to talk about is the general header and footer of the program. So here on the top, we have our general header. So we have the file menu where we can import, save as, the typical one like in any other program. In edit, we have basically undo history and preferences, which is quite important. Then we have render, so we can render our image and our animation from here, or view it if it's been rendered before. And we can create new workspaces and windows, but we won't worry about that until later. Now, an important one is help and the manual. So if we click on this button, we get to the online Blender manual. So that's quite important because a lot of times, even myself, I regularly reference tools or options that I'm not quite sure of. So then continuing, we have different kinds of scopes, basically. They're workspaces that are preset for different options. So we have layout, we have modeling, which is a bit cleaner user interface, and then all the other ones. But generally, I think layout will be the one that we'll be using the most and adjusting to our needs. Now, on the bottom here, we have the general footer, and that displays options for whatever current tool we have enabled. And you can see it gives us an option for what happens when we have a click with the left mouse button, with the right mouse button, and with the middle mouse button. Now, in here, you may not be seeing a lot of these menus, or options rather, and information. So if you want to enable them, if you right-click somewhere over here, and you can check all of these elements. Now you have to do it one by one, but I find it that it's quite useful to see everything that's going on, so I like to have them all enabled. How many objects we have, the memory usage, and visual RAM usage. Now, as you can imagine, the most important window in all of this is our 3D viewport, which is the big window that we have over here. So within it, we also have its own sort of header area. And we have a toolbar on one side, and then we have a sidebar, which may be hidden by default. You can expand it by clicking this little arrow over here, and we have a series of tabs within the sidebar, or by pressing N. So N for the sidebar, and then the toolbar can also be used with T. So T for toolbar, N for sidebar. So now let's get back to the viewport header. So on top over here, we have our options for our currently selected tool. And if you see, if we go to select box, it changes. It gives us options. Now it's important to know that these options live in 3 different places within Blender. Yes, that's quite a bit, but the reason for that is so you can set up Blender to work exactly the way you want it. So I'm going to show you where they live in other places. So in the sidebar, under tool, you see here we have the same options. So if we click a different tool, it's basically the same. And in the properties, we also have these options here. So 3 different places to use it. As you can see, if we change, all 3 options sort of change. Now, I don't like this extra header because it takes up unnecessary space. So I like to actually hide it. So we can go and right click here and uncheck show tool settings. If you want to get back to it, you can right click somewhere here in the area and click on header and then show tool settings and it'll be back for you. Okay, so now let's go ahead and walk through the menu. So we have view, and here we can set up different kinds of views. So we can set an active camera, we can choose a view, but really there's a better way to align the views and to move the views around, and that's with this gizmo over here. So if we click on Z, we get a top view. If we click on X, we get a side view, and we can move around. Or if we click on the camera, we get our camera view. Now, I'll be introducing hotkeys as we go through, and there's some that are quite important to know. One of them is the asterisk key, which is just next to 1 on top of the tab button. And we get this pie menu, which is also a hotkey for giving us different view options. So top view, view selected, if we have something selected, bottom view camera, and so on. The next menu is the select menu, and here we can select the different things. And again, these are some of the elements we will cover as we walk through the process of modeling. But an important hotkey to mention is A and Alt A. Alt A to deselect all, and A to select all. Next, we already covered add. So from this menu, we can add all kinds of new different objects. So we covered mesh, plane, and cube. So those are the two that we'll work the most with. But that's also where we get lamps and cameras. So any object gets added through this menu here. The object menu is a huge menu containing almost a series of submenus for doing everything with the objects. So we can transform, we can move the origin, and the origin is this orange point right here. Mirror, snap, duplicate, copy, paste, and so on. So let's click on this object now, and let's click on transform. Let's rotate it slightly. So if we click on the move tool now, you see our gizmo is still oriented to the global axis. If we want to change that, we can go ahead here in the middle area and change this from transform orientation global to local. And as you can see now, it adjusts to the local axis of rotation. And that works with any of these, so rotate and scale also work with that. And there's a series of different ones, but the ones we'll use the most are global, local, and sometimes normal. Now, what if we don't want the cursor to be there? We can move our sort of gizmo point to a different place. So if we click on 3D cursor, for example, no matter how far away we move our object, you see our gizmo is still at that point. If we move our 3D cursor around and we go to move, that's where our move point is located. And again, there's a series of different ones, but for right now, we'll work on medium point. And then we have the snaps menu. Now we have snap to increment, which is grid-based, vertex, edge, and so on. I usually work with vertex, but you can also actually enable multiple ones. So if I shift click, we can enable multiple ones. Now we can either enable it here. In fact, I think increment one would be a useful one to show you now. So you can see, actually, I think I need to zoom in. So you can see it's moving based on the grid. Let's make our array a little bit smaller so we can see things better. I'm going to change both the X and the Y. Okay, now you can see how we can array. Now, I don't usually have this option checked, but what we can do is when we have an active command, like move or rotate, if I click and hold and move, and I hold Control while still in the command, we can actually snap. So that's a temporary enabling of the snap options. And that works with whatever we have set up here. So now if I click on vertex, and let's duplicate this object. So object, duplicate objects, and we'll just move it somewhere over here. And now I change to vertex selection, and I don't have this enabled. So let's do a free move by holding this sort of white circle that highlights itself when we click over it. And if I press Control now, you can see we're snapping. So over in this corner here, we have a series of different elements that are related to what we see on the viewport. The first one is gizmo, and here we have everything to do with the gizmos. Now, if we click on select box, and we click this submenu here, viewport gizmos, and click on move and scale. If we select an object, even though we're not in this tool, we have access to that gizmo. That's kind of like a universal gizmo settings. And you can see if we uncheck it, all the gizmos go away. Not only this gizmo, but all of these gizmos that were around here. So I actually like to leave this on with object gizmos with move and scale enabled by default, because we tend to move things quite a lot. And instead of having to switch commands every time in the toolbar, we can just select elements and move them right away. And that works with box selection as well. So if we have both of them, we can move them together. The next pop-up is the viewport overlays. And if we uncheck that, you see we have a very clean viewport. We don't have information about our scene. We don't have a grid. We don't have anything except the gizmos, because gizmos is a different pop-up. So if we disable all of these, this is a very nice kind of clean viewport. And then we have our viewport shading. So this icon over here is wireframe. Then we have solid. Then we have material preview. And then we have rendered. Now, depending on the rendering engine, that's going to use the exact settings that we have for our render setups. Now, if we go back to solid, this middle icon over here is X-ray. So if we click on that, we can sort of see to the projects, and that becomes quite important when we're trying to edit, or even in this case, if we try to move our object, and we want to snap it to a point that's not necessarily visible. We can do it with X-ray. Next, let's move on to the sidebar. So N is the hotkey. So if we enable that, we see all of these sub-tabs popping up. So this is where add-ons live. And as you can see, I have a few extra ones which you probably don't have, which is Create, Blender Kit, and Sketchfab. We'll talk about these just in a second. But now let's focus on item. If I click on an object, we can see the location. And that's the same as that orange point over there. So if I move this in the viewport, you see that the location is changing. So we can also click and hold here and move those elements around. Or we can type them. So let's put 0, tab 0, 0. Our origin point is exactly where it was before. Rotation works in the exact same way. So we can rotate here. Let's put these back to 0 and let's put Z to 0. So I find these very useful because sometimes we want to be quite precise with our movements, and this allows us to be so. I know a lot of people sometimes say that Blender is not a really precise tool. Well, if you know how to use it, it actually could be a very, very precise tool. Because we always have access to these tools, so location, rotation, scale. And yeah, scale works in the same way. And then dimensions. So this is quite a useful one. So if you want our size of our cube array here, for example, to be a specific size, let's make it 10 by 10 meters. All right, so now it's quite specific, and let's make it 10 meters tall. So what's important to note is that these dimensions here represent the overall object. So not just our individual object, but what we have after the modifier stack has been applied. Let's make this now 5. And Z maybe 2. So within the sidebar, we covered tool options already. So these are some options that we have if we have some additional elements set up. And there are some important ones actually. So if we expand options and then expand transform and click on affect only origins. For example, we can only move the origin point around without moving our actual object. And we can snap to the origin point like we can snap anywhere else. So for example, now our origin point is here, but our object is stayed at the same place. Just make sure you uncheck that once you use it. And if we go to item, now the location being shown is the exact location of the origin point. So if we change these all to 0, by the way, we can click and hold and drag all 3 and press 0. And we can change them all at once, like this. So you can see now our origin point has moved. Now going into the next tab, which is the view. So in here we can set up some settings about the viewport. And really that's the only one that's important, which is clip start and clip end. So sometimes our object could be really large or really small. Now for architecture, we don't really need to worry about the clip start too much, but the clip end sometimes may need to be adjusted if we're dealing with really large scenes. So I usually leave it like this to start with, and then maybe add another 0 for 100,000, or just change it to like something like 5,000 meters. Focal length is quite important. With architectural scenes, I tend to think that 50 mil for focal length is quite narrow. So if we change that to 30 millimeters, we kind of see more of our object in the viewport. They get a bit more distorted around the ends, but this seems to be a bit better for what we typically deal with. Now, if you really like orthographic view, we can change it with this icon over here. Now we have an ortho view. The user interface is also quite flexible, so we can click and hold an area that's between two windows and we can change it. And in fact, any window can become any other window. So if I click and expand this timeline here, which we won't be using much, and change it with this icon over here to 3D viewport, now we have another 3D viewport. Now, if we don't want this window to exist anymore, if we right click in the border area, we can do join areas. And you see how the arrows point? So that means that the top viewport will become the dominant viewport, the bottom window will disappear. Okay, so moving on, let's talk about the outliner, which is over here. So that contains all the objects that we have in our scene. So we can click and select items directly within the outliner. And as you can see here, we have a little icon. That's an eye icon, and we can hide things. But it's a little bit deceptive because even though we're hiding it in the viewport, this will still render out. And the reason for that is that there's a hidden setting that we need to enable. So if we click on this icon over here, this is filter. So if we click on it, and we have different restriction toggles. So we want to enable a few of them. So this one is selectable. This one is disable in viewports, and this one is disable in renders. So now if we exit out of there, we see we added all of these elements here. So you see with our cube, even though it's hidden in the viewport, this last camera here means that it will be rendered out. Now it will not be rendered out. And this screen icon means it's disabled in the viewport. So basically the difference between the eye icon and the screen icon is that this is more of a temporary hide, and this is more of a disable hide. So if we uncheck our collection, which turns it off, and we check it, you see this hide gets reset. Whereas in the viewport, if we uncheck and check, that keeps it as is. And the cursor is basically to allow us to select objects or not select them. So if we uncheck this, now we're not able to select elements. In fact, I don't have this one. And if we check them, once again, we're able to select. In Blender, layers are called collections. Right now we have one collection here. So we can uncheck, hide, or disable in the viewport the whole collection. So if we uncheck, everything goes away. To make a new collection, we click this plus icon here in the top right hand corner, and we create a collection. Now if we have one collection active, we have a sub collection that's made within it. We can click and drag it out to move it out. To move objects in different collections, we click and drag them in. We can click and drag select multiple to move them in different collections. And again, collections could be infinitely nested, so we can put that collection back in there. And we can change the order of collections. So I have a setup one here that I use, and I'll move that one just above this collection here. And again, if we don't want this, we can move these to the parent collection here. We can also rename all objects, so collections and objects alike. So let's change this to, let's call this geometry. Let's drag this one out, select our cubes, so we can shift select to select multiple within the outliner and move them to the geometry collection. Now, if we want to change our camera, let's call this main cam. And within the viewport, we can also press F2, and we have a little pop-up that allows us to change the name of the selected object. Now, if we want to show or hide multiple elements, we can click and hold and just drag up, and it changes all of them. So click and hold, and it drags them all up. We can also search for objects. So if we have a lot of elements, we can find them. So let's look for cam. And it highlights the element. Next, let's move on to the properties, which is this window over here. So this properties window contains information pertaining to the currently selected object, including modifiers, object data, location, materials, and so on. It contains information about our world and about our rendering setup. So we already talked about the modifiers tab, which is here where we can see a series of modifiers. We talked about materials, which are over here. We can click and add multiple materials and rename them. And this camera icon, similar to the camera icon over here, pertains to rendering. So Blender has two render engines, Eevee and Cycles. Eevee is a real-time viewport rendering engine, so it's similar to Unity and Unreal, and Cycles is a ray tracing rendering engine. So let's take a look quickly. I've changed to Cycles. And now if we go to viewport preview, we see this. Let's add a lamp really quickly. So add or Shift A. That's another hotkey that I think you should know because I tend to use it all the time. and it saves time without having to go all the way up to the header to click add. So Shift A, light, point, and right now our cursor is really far away. So let's change the intensity of the lamp and we can start to see its effect. Now if we go back and switch to Eevee, we can also see its effect. Now for architecture, Cycles is still the preferred choice because it gives better ray tracing results, but for animations, Eevee is the preferred choice because it allows you to render out frames in seconds instead of minutes. And we'll talk about later how to set up our rendering settings better. So with our object selected, we have modifiers, we have materials, and we have something here which is object data. And that pertains to whatever the type of object that we have is. So if we go and click on a light, you see that icon, the green icon, it changes. So let's click back again. That's the mesh data, light, and camera. And each one has their own respective properties that are relevant to that kind of object data. Now let's talk about the world settings. If you want to change your units, we'll click this icon over here, which talks about the scene, expand units, and by default it's metric. I actually like to work with none, but if you want, you can also change to imperial and change to separate units to work with feet and inches. And now you see we have proper feet and inches. So as you can see in the properties window, there's a lot of subtabs. So we'll continue to cover each options as they become pertinent to what we're doing at the moment. Okay, so what if we want to adjust our user interface now? So we can right click around these corners here, and we can either do a vertical or horizontal split. So let's do a horizontal split. And you can see wherever we hover over, it gives us an option to split that window. So let's split it over here. And as I mentioned, each window has this sort of icon here in the top left-hand corner, which allows any window to be any other kind of window. So if we go ahead now, and maybe we want this to be properties again. So we have another set of properties. What it's most useful for is for having multiple 3D viewports or having a shader editor, which is how materials are handled. So now we can edit our material here, and we have our 3D viewport here. If you right click here, we can also swap the areas. Let's swap them back and right click, and we already covered how to join the areas back together. That should cover the basics to really get you started with understanding Blender. Let's talk about our preferences. So if you go to edit and preferences, and we get this pop-up window over here with a series of options. So there aren't too many things that we really need to change for us to use Blender, but I'll just show you the ones that I prefer to have switched on and how I use Blender. So if we go to navigation, I have orbit around selection and auto perspective, auto depth, and zoom to mouse position enabled. The defaults tend to change a little bit, so some of these may be turned on while some are not. And then if we go to system, make sure you change the undo steps to something larger than the default, which I think is 32 steps. I have mine at 132 steps. Note that Blender does tend to slow down a little bit if you have too many, but I found this to work quite well for me. Now, if you have an external GPU, you should be able to switch either to CUDA, Optics, or OpenCL. So CUDA and Optics are for NVIDIA cards, which tend to work better with Blender, and OpenCL, I believe, is for AMD GPUs. The other setting that I really like to change, and it's personal preference really, is to have the render pop out in a separate window or use the existing user interface. By default, it renders in a new window, and I like to change that option to image editor. And we already covered the status bar, but if we want to, here we can actually check and uncheck the things that we have selected in the status bar. And you can see them adjusting. Now, you may have noticed that your camera is black and light black as well. And I like to change those colors. So if we go to themes, 3D viewport, and we can click on camera. I tend to make mine a little bit bluish, and empty, which is a helper object, which we'll actually be using a few of those, which is green, and then light, which is something beige towards yellow. And the other option I like to change is under node editor, scrolling all the way down, and enable noodle curving. So noodle curving is whether we have curves here or whether that's a straight line. I've been working with Grasshopper for a long time before I started working with Blender, so I sort of got used to having curved connectors. So I like to leave mine at 4. Okay, now let's talk about add-ons. So if we click on add-ons, we have here a series of elements, and there are a lot of add-ons actually that we can see. A lot of them come bundled with Blender, but are not enabled by default. So I'm going to walk you through the ones that I tend to need all the time. So the first one is stored views. So we can search for add-ons right away over here. Stored views. So stored views lives in the view sidebar. And it's a little subtab called stored views. We have to press initialize. Let me drag this out. It essentially lets us save either views, save current, and now go here and save current. And we can sort of go back to a view that we really like without having to commit to actually generating a camera, because sometimes setting up a camera can be a bit too much. However, this does also allow us to make cameras. So if we like a view, we can click new camera to view, and now I've just generated a new type of camera. And we can also really easily toggle between the currently active camera. We can also toggle cameras by clicking within the outliner on the green icon. And now we see what the camera sees. Okay, the next add-on that we should enable is sun position. And that's another one that comes with Blender. And it's very useful for setting up sun. By the way, I have a few videos on YouTube talking specifically about add-ons for architectural design, where I cover them in a bit more detail. But let's go on here with the list. So now if we go to the World tab, we have a new subtab called Sun Position. So let's add a new light. So Shift A, sun. Doesn't matter where it is. And now we can enter coordinates to find our element, or there are some presets that actually work. But to get the presets, if we go back into the preference window, there's show options or labels. So we want to enable time and place presets. And now we have some position presets. Let's choose London, for example. And what that does is it essentially sets up the latitude and the longitude of our space. Next, let's use our sun object. So if we click and hold the sun, or we can actually, this is a drop down, so we can select the sun this way. And you can see our sun is now oriented. So if we go ahead and change the time of the day, or the year, or the month, our sun adjusts. So that's very handy to have nice animations, or just for sunlight to have something that's a bit more accurate. The next add-on that we want to enable is Magic UV, and that essentially has some tools that help us enable UV unwrapping easier. And then modifier tools. So with modifier tools, we just get these 4 buttons that are not there by default, and they help being able to disable or enable our modifiers in the properties. So viewport visibility, or apply them all, or expand or contract them. Now with the modifiers, these icons are essentially the same as the ones we have in the outliner. So we can disable these modifiers in the viewport, but they'll still render out, or vice versa. We can see them in the viewport or disable them. Now it takes a while to get used to having a separate visibility control within the viewport and within the rendering settings, but you have to be conscious of it because sometimes you can tend to forget it. So always double check those. Okay, next on the list is material utilities, and that helps us clean up materials better. We want to enable then edit mesh tools, and that comes bundled with an offset edges tool, which is really important to architectural workflows. Then let's enable ArchiPack, which allows us to create architectural elements. Blender Kit, which is an online asset library, so it comes in handy to drop in cars, for example, or trees, or something else, or materials even within our scene. Let's enable Node Wrangler, which allows us to set up some node settings easier. Bool tool, which allows us to work with booleans easier. And make sure you check display as wireframe for Bool tool. And those are the bare essentials for bundled add-ons. Now there's a few add-ons that I think are absolutely necessary that are external add-ons, and I'll give you the link from where you can download them. To install external add-ons, download the files from their respective location, and then click on install and go to your downloads folder and just select the zip file that it came with. Here I have my notes. So the first one is cat transform. So when you install cat transform, you get this button over here, which allows us to move with the base point. Now if we click on the tool options, we get a series of hotkeys here. So G, R, and S. So G for grab or move, R for rotate, and scale. So if we press G, you can see now we can snap, and we can move much more precisely. And the important thing is we can also move in the viewport where we're snapping. That's an absolute must for architectural design. The next one is Cube Blocker. So Cube Blocker is essentially like interactive primitives, which are bundled with Blender now, but it has a few more options. Shift A, Cube Blocker, plane cube, and you can see we can either draw here or here. But what I like about it is that we can specify the origin to be at the bottom. So we have this pop up here, and if I press O for the origin, and you see now, even though we created this cube, the origin stays near the bottom. So if we try the same thing with the built-in tool, we can create cubes in the exact same way, but there is no way to specify where the origin occurs. And the last one is Lily Surface Scraper. So when you install Lily Surface Scraper, if we click on an object and we go to materials, and we have something here that's a pop-up. And essentially what this add-on allows us to do is to automatically import material setups. So it works with the following websites. So if we go to CC0 textures, we can search for any texture. Let's find this brick, copy the URL, and then click import from clipboard. It would take a moment, and it allows you to choose the variant and then download it. And there we have the material property setup. It also works with world setups. So if we scroll down, we can import the world from HDRI Heaven, for example, with the exact same way. Now, once we set up a scene the way that we like to, we can use that as a default scene. So if I erase these cubes here, and I'm going to put our snap back into the center. So hotkey for snap is Shift S, and then cursor to world origin, Shift A, and let's just add a plane. Zoom in here. And let's say we want to say this is our default scene. We can go to File, Defaults, and save this as the startup file. Now I have my own startup file, and I would suggest you to work with this and set up your own startup file just so you can be able to see the icons that you need in the outliner and enabling the gizmo and any other settings that you have. For example, I don't need the timeline here, so I changed this to a shader editor, so it's easy if we're adjusting materials. A custom file would also have different layouts here, so you can duplicate your own, and that will be saved within your custom startup file. Now I'll save this file so you have access to it, and within it we also have notes. So if we go and change this to a text editor, let's rename this and call it add-ons. So you can see the add-ons list, and let's create a new text, and let's call that further resources. So there are a couple of other resources that would be useful for you to know. You may already know them, but I'll just mention them anyway. So one is textures.com. So chances are you probably already know this website, but textures.com is the best place to get textures, really. They have an extensive library. You do need to register with them, but you do get 15 free credits per day, I believe it is. And with the free pack, you can download the small and the medium size usually, but I tend to find the medium is mostly what I need for a huge chunk of the time. Then we have Polygon, which is started by the Blender guru, Andrew Price, which is quite useful again for materials. So let's figure out how to search. Right, we click on textures here, and they have loads of textures. Now this doesn't have a free, well, actually maybe there are some free ones. Free, yeah, there's some free ones. Oh, there's a lot more free ones than I thought there were. That's good to know. So this is also for textures. They do sell models. I haven't really worked with their models just yet, but I know they cost quite a bit. Then there's Blender Kit, and this is the most useful one because it comes bundled with Blender. So you don't even need to download something externally. You can search and go and find it. In fact, let's show you how Blender Kit works. So first you need to log in. Once you log in, you have a search menu here, or by default it pops over here, but I removed that. So let's search for a car. It's going to start searching, and it will show us some cars. Now the ones with locks are paid for, but in the search filters, we can enable to see the free ones first. There was an option, I think, previously just to show the free ones, but I understand that they want to sell their memberships. So yeah, you can have a premium membership and get even more of everything. But I find this incredibly useful because we don't even need to exit Blender to be able to download things right away. Now, I do tend to download these in a separate file and kind of clean them up. A lot of these come with like quite complex objects, which are probably more than what we need. So we can go and edit them. And we can also search for materials. Let's see if we can find road. Loads of road textures here as well. Okay, next on the list is Sketchfab, which you probably know as well already. And they have loads of free models. So if you search for people, for example, and click on downloadable, and we can find people to download. Now, it's a bit subtle, but if you can see, there's a dollar mark on the ones that cost money, and there's a download button for the ones that are free. So these people I use all the time. Going on the list, then we have Blend Swap. You need to register for this as well, but this is all free models. If you like the guys, you can support them with the one-time fee or become a monthly supporter. The quality for this is so-so. There's some really good elements, but some of them are not so good. But it's definitely a huge asset just to have this available. And then we have Blender Market, which has all things Blender. This is by far the most popular platform for Blender. And they have loads of add-ons, but also assets like buildings, for example. Let's go and check out buildings. And some of them are quite good quality. Or trees, another hotly contested topic. So many trees for reasonable prices as well. Now we can also always use SketchUp Warehouse. Many models have an option to download collada file. There's also Shocklefur, which is specific to Blender. Now this tends to be mostly for interiors, so not so relevant for larger architecture scenes, but the products tend to be quite good quality, and they also have some free assets. So I think we can go and search for the free ones. So yes, as you can see, loads of interiors with pretty decent quality, and also shaders as well. And on top of this, we could still use our regular TurboSquid and EverMotion models. We just have to convert the materials, which does end up taking a bit of time. So I would suggest if you need some assets, check out the Blender places first. You can start with the free ones, then something like Blender Market or Gumroad. Also, if you do a search on Gumroad, it has a lot. Alright, time to move into mesh modeling. So Blender has a lot of things that it can do really well. It's a general 3D suite that's suitable for many processes. However, specifically to architecture design, mesh modeling is the core feature toolset. Within Blender, we have something called object mode, and then we have edit mode. So if we click on edit mode, first off, you see that our toolbar changes and we have a lot of new options. And then we have a little submenu here, which allows us to either click on vertex, edge, or face. So with vertex, we can click on these vertices. Edge, we can click on edges and move them around. And faces, we can click on the faces to move them around. The hotkeys for these are tab to change from object to edit mode. So that's a very important one to know. And then within edit mode, 1 gives us access to vertex selection, 2 edge, and 3 face. 1, 2, 3, and tab. Now, if you accidentally hit 1, 2, or 3 in object mode, let's click 1, and we see nothing. So, not a big fan of these hotkeys, but they do exist there, so you need to be aware of them because it may happen at some point. But essentially, in object mode, the keys 1, 2, and 3, and so on, allow us to temporarily disable all collections except the one currently selected. So 1 for the first collection in our list. If I click on 2, we should see the cameras. And if I click on 3, you see all these hide. But don't worry, if we click Ctrl Z, within Blender, it actually changes the collection visibility as well and selection sets. So you can click Ctrl Z to get back in case you accidentally missed it with that cheeky 1, 2, and 3. So the object is the container and the object data is the elements within the container. The best way to explain it is with a cup of water. Our object is the glass and our water is our object data that sits inside of it. The water can't really exist within the glass, at least not in the shape for you to drink it. You know, you can spill it, you can clean your garden or floor with it, but in order to drink water, you need it to have it in a glass. So the object data always exists within an object. So now let's enable the sidebar and let's go back into object mode for a second. So within object mode, we see the location, which is 0, 0, 0. If we move it around a little bit, we see that it adjusts. And that's for the object origin point. Now, if we go into edit mode, we have access to the same elements, but for each element selected. So that gives us the middle point, the median point, and you can tell by the gizmo of where the location of that face is selected. Or if we go to 1 and select the vertex, we see the position of that vertex. Next, we have global and local. So let's move our object a little bit higher. And now if we go back into edit mode, the local is the difference between our currently selected element and the origin point. And global is the difference between our currently selected element and our object global origin, which is the center. Now the orange icon is our object property. So no matter which kind of object we click, they all have the same kind of options available. The green icon in the properties is the object data properties. So that changes depending on what we have selected. So now we have a camera and now we have a mesh. And with a mesh, you see we have a series of other properties that are available to us. Now each object data is its own element. So here we see cube and here we say plane 002. Let's change this to surface. So that's the name of the object data. But you see our object doesn't change. So what does that really mean? Well, it makes it easy for us to link objects together. For example, if we don't want this cube to be a cube, but we want it to be a mesh, we can click here and click on surface. And you see now it's that container changed what's on the interior. This is quite nice because now these are linked and we can tell by the number 2 over here. So if I go and change something on this one, let's move this down. You see that both of them changed. If we ever want to make this an independent copy, we can just click the 2 and it will become a duplicate. Or we can also go back to the cube and the cube changes. Now in this drop down menu, we only see objects that are the same type. So the camera, it also has these. So we can have linked cameras that, for example, have the exact same settings, lights and so on. So we can also duplicate this object. So an object duplicate objects. So we have Shift D. So that's another icon that's quite useful because we always end up duplicating objects, right? Or if I undo all these, Alt D, which as you can see here, duplicate linked. And if we go and try to edit one, they're all linked. So this is essentially like blocks in Rhino or in AutoCAD or components in SketchUp, if you're familiar with those programs. When we go back to edit mode, and we see a series of new options appearing in the toolbar. If we click and hold the same distance away here, we can click once and keep dragging and holding. We can actually see the names of all the different commands. So that's quite useful when you're trying to learn things. So we have extrude, inset, bevel, and so on. But what we actually do is cover these with the practical example, which we're going to start building up right now. We're ready now to start with our modeling for our building. So the first thing we want to do is delete the default cube. Shift A, add mesh plane. Now let's change the dimensions to 8 meters by 8 meters. Next, let's go to materials and go to available resources and let's select CC0 textures. Go to assets and search for road. We're going to make our road section the first element. And I quite like this road over here. So let's select this road, copy the link, Control C, back in Blender, click on import from clipboard. Now it's going to take a minute and we want to use the 2K JPEG. So we don't want something too large. And now it's imported. If we want to preview it, let's click on material preview node. And now we have our road section. And if we see what the material looks like, it may look quite complicated at first, but it's not. So we can expand any window to full size by clicking Control Space. So let me walk you through this because a lot of materials are set up in the exact same way. So we have a principled BSDF. That's the basis of the material. Most materials use this in one way or another. Then we have the base color, which we have as a texture. And then we have our roughness. So that determines different elements. Then we have a normal map. And here I think they're switching some channels around. That's why it looks more complicated. And displacement. And actually we don't need displacement in this case. So we can delete all that. As you can see, our material doesn't really change too much. If you feel overwhelmed by all this, don't worry. We'll cover some basic examples and we'll make some materials from scratch a little bit later down the road within this course. And next, we want to do a couple of things to it. We want to use only half of it so we can model our sidewalk and our curb and have that mirrored on the other side. So now if we go into edit mode, press Ctrl R, and Ctrl R creates loop cuts. Now Ctrl R only works with quad geometry. So quad geometry is any face that has 4 vertices. So that's sort of the basis of mesh modeling. We always need 4 vertices to work with, and then we can subdivide our mesh easily. We also have the same tool in the toolbar over here, loop cut. So we see a yellow line showing which way we want to cut. If I click and then hold, we can move our loop cut around. But I'm going to press escape, and then it puts it exactly in the middle. Next, delete half of our face. So I'll select this face. X is a shortcut to delete. You can also use the delete button, but X is much closer to your left hand in case you use the mouse with the right hand. So it makes it a little bit easier to get access to it. So X, and then we have a series of options here. So we can delete different things. In this case, we want to delete the face. Now it's very important that our origin point is in the middle, because now what we're going to do is go into the modifier panel, add modifier, and we'll add a mirror modifier. It's an exact mirror of what we have on one side. We can also change some settings. So if you expand the data and we want to click on mirror U, this object looks exactly the way it looked before we mirrored it, and our texture is applied correctly. Next, let's add an array modifier. And right now it's going in the wrong direction. So let's go to top view by clicking the Z in edit mode. So from medium point, we want to change to 3D cursor, and that snaps. Next, we can either select the rotate tool in the toolbar or press R to rotate. And then we can type 90 and it snapped. Now it's very important that when you use the R command without the tool, where we don't have access to the gizmos that gives us the axis from which we're working, that you work in an orthographic view. Even if we're slightly off, the rotation will be off. We need to go and fix our mirror modifier by changing the axis from X to Y and uncheck X. We have our correct section. So if we expand the array, you see our road duplicates. So that's great. We already have a non-destructive object. It's a very simple one. It's a plane, but it has 2 modifiers, which means that now we can only build one side and the other side will be duplicated automatically. Within the array command, if we scroll down, and let's check merge to make sure that these actually become one object. It essentially allows us to use less geometry. Okay, now in edit mode, I'm going to go to the regular box select. And we want to adjust a couple of things here. So first we want to move this edge a little bit closer to where that line is. So make sure that we switch from 3D cursor back to medium point. Now if we drag that, you see it actually drags our whole texture. There's an option within tool and then options to correct face attributes. It's a little bit hidden, but it's important to know that because we'll be using it all the time. If we click and hold, you see the texture stays where it is, but we're just dragging out other different elements. And in fact, we can make this really large road. So let's drag it somewhere closer to the edge. That's pretty good. Now, if we want to, we can uncheck that and maybe we can make this road a little bit longer. So we've got a longer section. I have to inspect this to see how it looks in 3D. Yep, and that looks quite all right. We do want to do one thing, which I found always helps a bit, which is to raise the middle of the road slightly up. Now we're going to insert another loop cut. So let's use the loop cut tool here. So click and hold and move that somewhere over here. Now let's select that face. So go to face selection with select box. And let's just move that 0.2, so 200 millimeters up. Let's model the curb. Go to edge selection and we can extrude with the extrude region tool here. And we have to check a few options. So we want in the XYZ direction. And now we can click and hold and let's type 0.1, extrude again, 0.1, and then extrude again. And this time we'll type minus 0.02. Let's extrude again, this time 2.5 for the sidewalk. And then we will extrude again, and that's for something beyond the sidewalk, which is unspecified at the time. These materials don't look quite right here. They look extremely stretched from the edges that we have happening on that side. The reason being is for something called UVs. So if we go to shading and we click on this face, now let's enable our road here to be seen. Let's change this a little bit over so it's easier to see. So with the UV editor, we see where this face occurs within our texture, right? So if I move a corner around, you see the whole texture sort of gets distorted. Now, if we click on these faces, they actually are a thin line at the moment. So if I shift click this face, and also that little face here, and then go to the UV and then unwrap, and you see now it looks a little bit more manageable. They're all unwrapped within here. Okay, let's go back to our regular layout now. So we want to assign a couple of different materials here. So let's find some nice pavement. So we'll select the material tab again. We'll create a new material slot. So now with this element selected, let's assign, and that puts it in this material slot here. Next, let's go again from CC0 textures, assets, and let's type pavement. And let's use this pavement here. Select variant. We want to use the 2K JPEG. And now we have our texture, which at the moment, as you can see, looks huge. So let's actually select all of these faces that we unwrapped. And assign the same material. And now what we can do is actually select the faces based on their material. So in here we have assign, select, and deselect. So let's select this texture, and it selects only the elements that have that texture. If we deselect everything and then select the road, it only selects the faces that have that texture. Okay, so let's select the pavement elements again. If you enabled previously the UV Tools add-on, we're going to use it now. If you haven't, go to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons. I think it's called Magic UV. So with that add-on selected, if we click on UV, we have some options, a lot of options by the way, probably a bit overwhelming. And if we scroll the way down to UVW and we use box. Now this is one of my favorite tools that comes from an add-on within Blender. The reason being, let me show you. Let's create a new mesh plane, scale it to something huge. And then what we need to do is, because in object scale, the scale is quite large, actually need to apply the scale. So if we go to object, apply, scale, and now we assign the exact same material. So if we go over here and say paving stones, and let's rename this and say pavement, and then for the road, let's say road. And as you can see, they're huge right now. If we go into edit mode, UV, UVW box, now they become quite small, actually much smaller than what we have here. And I think the reason is that our object scale here wasn't applied. So it's that scale times 4. So what we need to do is apply our scale here as well in our road. So object, apply, scale. Now if we go into edit mode again, everything should still be selected. UV, UVW, box. So the nice thing here is that no matter our object size, when we do the UVW box command, it unwraps everything to almost the real scale in a way, which doesn't exist in any of the other UV tools, at least not to my knowledge. So I find this very useful command. This pattern may look a little bit tiled initially, and don't worry, we'll fix that later. Right now, we're just putting these as sort of placeholders. Okay, so let's select this face now. Create a new material slot. So click the plus icon over here, press assign. Let's go back now to CC0 textures. And actually I saw this grass, which looks quite nice. It's big, so we're probably going to use only the 1K version of that. So let's select Ctrl C, import from clipboard, 1K JPEG, and let's call this grass. And again, very tiled, not very usable, but a good placeholder for the time being. Lastly, we want to change the material of our pavement edge. So let's go ahead and select in edit mode, shift clicking the faces. So these 3 faces here, create a new material slot. And this time we will actually create the material instead of import one. And let's call it curb and assign to make sure that we actually assign it. Okay, so now let's get down and dirty with materials. So that's the principle of BSDF. So if we change the material, it changes the color. We can make it metallic, and the roughness controls transparency. So if we make it metallic 1 and roughness 0, it's basically a mirror. And now it's rough metal. Now if we change the roughness back to 0.5 and metallic to 0. Now it's our default. We can also change the alpha strength here. And we have something that's called normals, which allows to create these sort of fake bumps around, which interact nicely with light. So for example, put our cursor here. The shortcut for that is Shift right click, by the way. Shift A. Let's add a point. Move it over here. And at the moment you can't see any impact is because we need to enable the lights in material preview mode. So if we click on this here, in viewport shading, let's enable scene lights. And let's change the strength. So now you can see the effect that this light has. And let's change its value a bit more. And if we move around, you can kind of see the effect that this light has. These have normals and these have normals, so they look quite different. Okay, now we have our material curve. So what do we want to do? We want to make it look a little bit like curve, not completely, but I want to show you a couple of the options that we have within Blender itself. So within the node editor, by the way, this is the shader editor, so it's over here. And you have to have our object selected. Let's go and add texture. We want to add a brick texture. So let's select this to the base color. And that's what we get here. Now let's change the offset to 0. And let's adjust the scale to something about the size of normal bricks. Maybe something along this size. And in fact, let's turn off our little light and change the strength of the backdrop again to 1. We can change the mortar size to something like 0.01. So it's much smaller. Then we have 2 color variations. So between these 2 colors, we can adjust how bright or how dark we want everything to be. And in this case, we want to make things fairly dark or fairly neutral. So there is slight variation, but not too much variation. And now we are going to add some noise. Shift A works in the same way in the shaded editor as it does in the viewport. Texture, and we want noise texture. Next, Shift A, color, mix RGB, and we can drag and drop these nodes in between, and they're going to sort of have an impact on what we're doing here. So now let's mix in the factor, and let's change this to multiply. If you're familiar with Photoshop or with Krita or Affinity Photo, with layers, they work in a very similar manner. So multiply makes everything darker, makes our base image darker. So now we've added some noise, except it looks a bit stretched on one direction. So we need to add something called texture coordinate. So Shift A, input texture coordinate. We want to use the object texture coordinate, and now it shouldn't be stretched anymore. And let's change the scale now to maybe 10. And we're starting to see some noise. All right, and we're going to do the same thing here. So G to move these around. Select these 2. Control Shift D to duplicate them with the connections. And now let's connect the multiplying here. Change this to screen. And connect this to the outer color. Let's change the scale a bit. It's going to take a minute to refresh itself to something like 23. Now this screen is a little bit too much, so let's change the value to maybe 0.1. And I think the mortar size is too large, so let's change that to 0.05. Okay, so now we have something a little bit more believable. We can also change the amount of detail and roughness. So if you see now, if we change the detail, it essentially adds a bit more variation. And let's do the same here. And maybe increase the darkness. Okay, it's not perfect, but that's quite nice. Now we're going to be using this setup quite a lot here. So what we're going to do also is set up a group. So let's select all of these 5 nodes and press Ctrl G to select the group. And now we get this sort of pop-up with a green backdrop, which tells us that we're inside of a group. So we want to have a bit of control within this group. So let's drag this factor out here and this factor out here, and then scale 1 and scale 2. Now we have to rename these. To rename them, we need to enable the sidebar, and it works in the same way as in the viewport. So if you click on this side icon here, we go to node and we have our input. So if you select factor 1, let's change that to multiply factor and make the default value something low, maybe like 0.2. Next we have screen fac, 0.1 is fine. There we have scale 1, and we can change the minimum and the maximum default. So let's change them to something like 0 and 100, and 20 is fine. and then scale 2, scale 2. Again, I'll just change these factors here. And now to exit out of the group, there's a little icon over here. So if we click on that, parent node tree. Cool, so now we've created a really neat node group that we only need to use once, and we can recycle it throughout all of our materials, which we'll be doing quite a bit. And we have all the controls that we need all inside of here. So if you want to, we can change the scale of the white or the black. And this scale doesn't feel like it's doing much, the white one. And the reason being is because the detail is quite high. So let's lower the detail down to maybe 5. And let's exit out of here. To enter a group, by the way, we click tab. Okay, and now let's rename this node group, call it noise. To add variation to our pavement and to our grass, we're going to use that same group. So in here, let's choose our pavement, which looks quite complicated. I see just an empty one hanging out here, so I'll delete that. And what we want to do is click Shift A, group, and we have one noise. And we want to drag it between the color and the base color. So if we drag it in here, now we should see our group popping up, and we can start to manipulate the values until we find something that we like. Now we just have to wait a second for the shader to load. It might be a bit hard to see because of the light and everything, so we might need to turn up the multiply factor quite a bit just to see the impact that we have, just so we can adjust our scale a bit more appropriately. I think in this case we need to use something quite small, maybe 0.02. And now let's turn this down. So now we have some sort of gradual noise that makes everything seem a little bit more different. Now let's turn up the noise here. Yeah, so the noise in here is doing a bit of a different job than it's doing here. Because we already have great variety, but we want to reduce the tiling effect. And to do that, we just add a bit of noise. Okay, and lastly, let's do the same thing for the grass. So let's go into the grass, zoom out. I'm going to delete this node here. Shift A, group, noise. And let's change the scale to 1 for both. Grass can look even more different, so I think that's quite all right. Maybe that's slightly too much. Okay, now it's looking quite all right. The base is done. The only other thing that I would like to do is add a bit of bevel to these two edges. So to do that, let's click inside. First, we need to be in edge selection. So select this edge and then select this one. Right click, bevel edges. And it's going to start beveling, or we can just type something like 0.03. That's too much. 0.015. Okay, so that just created that nice little bevel edge over there. And we can do the same with this edge. Control B is the shortcut, by the way, for bevel. And we can do something very, very subtle, something like that. So let's do one more thing here, which is add another modifier. We'll add another mirror modifier. The tricky bit is that because of our origin point, you can sort of see that there's a lot of elements here that are intersecting each other. So to fix that, if we use the bisect modifier, they'll stop intersecting. So now everything should be quite nice. We can also move the origin point, but that's a different way to do it. So now we have everything set up. Now the only thing I want to do as well is move the road down 0.08 minus. So now let's just check to see where this is located in global. In global, it's 0, 0. Great. Let's extend our grass field a bit more. And we're done. So in the next section, we're going to start blocking out our concept. So with the road ready, we're finally able to focus on our actual concept. So what we want is a building somewhere over here. One of the features the Blender has is being able to annotate in the viewport. So if we click on this tool over here, annotate, and we can start drawing. I have a small Wacom tablet. If you don't have one, I highly recommend getting a Wacom or even a Huion tablet. So as I mentioned earlier, we're going to use these people from Sketchfab, and particularly this guy over here. So we want to go and download the model, and GLTF is fine. In a new Blender file, let's open the downloaded file. So file, import, GLTF. It's going to import all the people. We have quite a few variations of them, and I think some of them are textured and some of them are not. Let's load material preview node to see who we want. So what we want is this guy. Now you see he's got a dashed line, and that's a parent relationship. To remove that parent relationship, go to Object, Parent, Clear, and Keep Transformation, and that's going to get rid of it. Okay, so now we have just our lovely gentleman here. Control C to copy him. So the textures at the moment are loaded from an external folder. So we want to make sure we pack them in. File, external data, pack all into blend. It says that no new elements have been packed. That's all right. So that's good. But we just double made sure that they're all packed. So Control C to copy him. Let's go back to our scene here and Control V to paste. Let's use the 3D cursor. So I'm going to position the 3D cursor somewhere over here. And then we can go to Object, Snap, Selection to Cursor. And that's going to put our person who's rather big. So let's select him. I don't know what scale this is in. So I'm just going to press S and scale down until he's about the right size of 1.8 meters tall. He's rotated, and you see here we have different rotations. So we can change this from quaternion to XYZ Euler to see the rotation. So we want to make sure this is at minus 90. We want to apply the rotation so it doesn't feel like it's minus 90. So we want to go to Object, Apply, Rotation. So now it's 0, 0, 0. And our dimensions are correct. So the Z axis. Now we can adjust the Z scale. So if I press S and keep holding, and I'm just looking at the dimensions here in the sidebar until I get something that looks about right. 1.816, 1.8, perfect. Control A is the same menu as we get in Object Apply. So we want to apply the scale. So that stays 1 to 1. Now we have a person in here that's in scale. Next, let's erase our annotation. Go to View, Annotations, and get rid of this. And let's draw a new one. First, I'm going to store the view. So stored views, initialize. And I'm going to get rid of these views and save current view. So the first thing we want to do is add a plane that's about the size of our footprint. So Shift A, Mesh, Plane, go to Item, and let's change the dimensions to something like 25 by 16. Let's move that to somewhere over here. Next, let's add the annotation tool. I know that I want this front be angled at some point and for there to be quite a bit of depth. So the facade will actually be inset to maybe that line over here. The facade is going to be a curtain wall. So this whole thing is going to continue all the way. And this is all solid. We have the building entrance somewhere over here. We have a gallery in this area. So the gallery entrance is going to be over here where we have a reception area, and from the reception we're going to come into the actual gallery. So we have a small building that sits on top, and we want to kind of play off of the angle that we have on that side. So the building is going to have an angle when it meets the base, and perhaps we can make an angle at the top as well. And we're going to have smooth corners here and here and here, and we will also have smooth corners on the building as well to sort of reflect the fact that it's a similar geometry. And then we'll have our levels here. Now I'm going to change the color of this annotation to black and then turn it off. Okay, so now that we know what we want to do, let's go ahead and start doing it. So the first thing we want to do is just really quickly block it out. To do that, let's add a modifier. We'll add a solidify modifier, change the offset direction to +1, so it's going to solidify along the normal direction, which in this case is up. And let's change the thickness to maybe 6 meters. And that's way more than 6 meters. And the reason being is that it's using this scale over here. So let me explain to you what's going on here. So our object scale is 1 times all these numbers. Our thickness of 6 is multiplied by, in this case, the Z scale, which is 1.9. If we increase the Z scale, you see our overall element increases. So we would need to apply the scale again for this to be correct. So Control A, scale, apply. And now it's exactly 6 meters tall. Now let's go into regular shaded mode. And in fact, let's give these materials some sort of color differentiation so we understand which material is what. Click the road. We have the surface, and then we have a subtab called Viewport Display. So let's change the color to something darker. Let's change the pavement as well. And let's change the grass. Now within my RGB sliders, you may notice I use the HSV. I find that to be more precise than the RGB sliders. And you can easily change between them. Okay, another thing that I'm noticing now that we don't have textures on our road is that it's sharp edged here. If we click on the object, right click, press shade smooth, now it becomes too smooth because it doesn't understand that we have some sharp corners. If we go to object data properties and we expand normals, there's a selection called auto smooth. Anything below the angle of 30 degrees, which can be manually changed, will be smooth. Anything over the angle, like 90-degree angles, will be sharp. So we have 90-degree angles pretty much everywhere. Everything is sharp except the middle, which is exactly what we want. Continue with our massing. So 6 meters is about the right height, and we'll have half of it sort of off. So now let's use the cube locker tool. So Shift A, cube locker. And if you don't have a cube locker, this is one of the add-ons that I mentioned in the initial add-ons video, but you can also use interactive primitives. I prefer the cube locker because it puts the origin at the base instead of the top. Let's create something like this. And the other nice thing that the cube locker has is that we can change the settings after the object has been done in the object data settings here. Pretty much the exact same that we have here in the dimensions. What we can do now though is figure out what size works well for our massing. Something along this size. Let me enable my gizmos here because I turned them off, and go to regular box selection. Select our box. And what do we have? About 12 meters by 12 meters. We want to make the X direction a little bit longer. So something like that. Let's use the annotation tool here again. Chisel this corner out, and maybe now I can change the color to something darker. Yep, that works. So we'll chisel this corner out. And then we have a smooth gradation over here, and that building will continue down, and all of these will be smooth as well. And the facade will come in a little bit further inside. Okay, so at this point, we can actually start modifying our actual massing. So let's select the base first, go to modifier properties, and we want to apply the solidify modifier, which basically means that it makes the geometry real. If we go into edit mode now, you see that we only see a plane. We can't do anything else except the plane because that solidify modifier is related to that plane. So if we go back into object mode and click this little arrow over here and select apply. So now the modifier is gone, and if we go back into edit mode, you see that this is being converted now into real geometry, which is exactly what we want. Next, let's get rid of some faces. So go into face selection, select this, X faces, the bottom one, X faces, and this one, X faces. Now I'm going to introduce a loop cut, so let's use the loop cut tool here. Click and hold to somewhere along there. Next, go back to selection, click on this edge, let's go into the item and change the global Z direction, and I'm seeing our object is slightly off, but that's okay. Sometimes actually there's some rounding errors, so if you see a really small fraction, it could be just because of the way the Blender works. Okay, so let's change that to 2.5. We can hide with H, if we press H, and you can see that does that temporary hide. If I press Alt H, it then hides everything. So that's our base. Next, we want to add a bevel modifier. So add bevel. And what we want to do is smooth out these corners here non-destructively. I'm going to change my matte cap to outdoor over here, so it makes everything a little bit easier to see. So now with bevel, we want the limit method to be angle. That's correct. And let's increase the strength, the amount. And now the scale of our object is actually wrong. So once again, Control A, scale to apply it. And let's change the amount to 3. It's an interesting one. So my active object is actually my hidden object. So I'm applying the scale to the hidden object. So let's undo that. And I have to select this. And you can tell, by the way, if we have multiple elements selected. So we have sort of like the dark orange and the light orange color. So the light orange color is the selected object. Why does that matter? Because the selected object is the one for which we can see the properties. So if we edit properties, they don't edit all the properties. They edit only the one object which is currently enabled. So if we go back to here now to our plane, in fact, let's start to get a little bit more organized here. So let's create a new collection and let's call that ground. Let's put this plane 2, double click to rename it, and let's call it roof. And let's rename this to person. Put the person in geometry, and we'll call this layer context, and that's road. Okay, so we have a setup layer which has cameras and lights. Then we have the context layer, and then we have our ground. With the roof selected, add modifier, bevel. Let's change the amount to 2, and let's change the segments to 7. That angle is much less than 30 degrees, so we can either take the angle down, or in this case, because we're actually beveling all the edges, we can change the limit method to none. Because essentially we don't have any other edges at the moment. That's probably a bit too much, so let's change this to 1. That's much better. Now this is jagged, so if you right click on the object and change to shade smooth, now it's shading better. Next, let's add another modifier, solidify. Change the thickness to 0.5, and we want the direction to be in the positive 1 direction. And we have the same issue we were having with the road, where everything is a little bit too smooth. So to change that, go to Object Data Settings, Normals, and click on Auto Smooth. And now that should look much better. So now we're going to use this geometry with a link. So we're going to create a linked duplicate. So Alt D to duplicate it, and then press Escape. We want to make sure that rendering is unchecked because we're going to use that to subtract our curtain wall. We don't need to draw it precisely as we have it here, and it's going to be also non-destructive, and we want to make sure that we can control that easily. So the easiest way to do it is to have linked geometry to the original roof. The modifiers are the object level, not the object data level, meaning that they're different for each instance of an object. So now let's change the thickness to something big. Let's try 8, and that's what we get. So let's hide this roof bulb for now. And now we're ready to add our curtain wall. Shift A, mesh plane, make sure that's in the right collection. And in fact, if you click on the collection icon, that's going to make it active. And let's change this to curtain wall. I'm going to move that somewhere over here. Go into edit mode, add a loop cut, go back into selection mode, select, invert or Control I, X, edges. So we deleted everything except our remaining edge. Next, we want to use this edge and E for extrude, Z, and let's go to maybe 3 meters. That's going to be our section. Now let's position this about the place where it should go. So somewhere over here and somewhere slightly inwards. So let's add an array modifier. Add array, and let's change the count. What we need to do before we add that array is, let's see the size of this. So it's 2 by 3 meters, which is a bit large. So I'm going to go into edit mode, and we can isolate just the selection, by the way. So if we go to view, local view, and toggle local view, or /, we can isolate just our element. So now I like to work quite tightly with the origin point. So what I'm going to do is drag this edge here 1 meter. And I know because the default plane in cubes are 2 by 2 meters wide. That's 1 meter by 3 meters, which is still a bit large for a pane of glass. So let's move this 200 mil, so 0.2, negative. In Blender, the nice thing is that we can toggle negative and positive at any point by just pressing negative. It doesn't need to come in the beginning. Let's toggle out of local view, and in case you're confused whether we're in local view or not, up here in the viewport information, you can see user perspective, and then it says local. When we exit out, it doesn't say that. That's better. And let's see our array and change the number to something along these lines. Now let's add another array, and this time factor X is going to be 0 and Z is going to be 1. And now we will add a boolean. And if you remember, if you turned on the bool tool, if not, it's a bundled add-on, so you can turn it on in the preferences. What we want to do is first select our bool and then our curtain wall. Go in the sidebar, edit, bool tool, brush boolean. So all the boolean are destructive, brush boolean are non-destructive. We want to do the non-destructive and say difference. So what it does is it uses this as a boolean, then it makes sure that it renders only as a wireframe. We need to change the solver from exact to fast, and now we're good to go. We can hide our roof boolean again, and let's continue with the stack. Let's create materials. So go to Material tab, create a new slot, add a new material. Let's call this glass. Let's change the viewport display for the time being to blue, and we can change the alpha value as well. So let's take the alpha value down. Create a new material, and let's call this frame. And let's change this to something dark. Nothing's coming up because we haven't assigned this material yet. So now if we go back to our modifier properties, add a modifier, and this time we're going to add a wireframe modifier. And now we have a wireframe. By default, the wireframe replaces the original. We want to uncheck this option. Now we have both. Next, we offset the material slot for the wireframe. So if we change one, now it's the correct color. And let's change the thickness to 0.05. And now we have something along these lines. So we have a bit of an error here with all these vertices being seen. That won't render because edges can't render, but there is a way to fix it. When we created the array, there's an option to actually merge our elements. So if we click on that once, we need to do it for both array modifiers, it should already look much cleaner. What if we want to go and change our shape a little bit? Select X-ray, select our face, and if we move this up or down, and then click out, and you see everything really nicely adjusts. If we make it really high, we actually don't have that many, but we can easily add another array or two. And we are popping a little bit out of where we should be of the bounds, but you get the idea. It becomes very easy and very fun to actually model and work with geometry. So let's put this back now at 6 meters. And the same is also true for our curtain wall. So if you don't like the selection, let's go into local mode here for a second. Control R to add another loop cut. And now let's put it at exactly 2.5 meters. So now we change the look of our curtain wall a little bit. And what do we need to do? We need to move these edges just slightly down because I'm noticing a couple of errors here with the booleans as well. So I'm going to select these two edges and let's move them at -0.01. And yes, I need to click out and now it should be gone. We have our curtain wall done. Next, let's duplicate this as linked again to put it on the other side. So Alt-D, and I am selecting the wrong thing here. So let's select this, Alt-D. And as you can see, the minute it stops booleaning with the face, it becomes a full face. We can actually remove the wireframe and I would just have glass, which we'll end up not really seeing much later. To continue with the stack with our roof, let's add another bevel modifier. We want to change this to angle and let's go into wireframe to make sure that everything is correct. And that looks so far so good. Let's go back into here. And now let's change the amount to something much smaller, maybe 0.03. Now, if you don't like how smooth these edges are, we want to be smoother. We go to our first bevel here and change the segments to maybe 10. And now you see it became much smoother. And again, if you want to see the actual topology, we can go into wireframe and see what's going on with our topology. So our base is done and it's time to move on to our tower on top. So we'll unhide our sketch model from before, go into edit mode, select the top face and then X and then vertices. This is going to erase the 4 vertices which make up all the other surrounding faces. So now we just have this element over here. So with the tower, we're going to make it quite non-destructive as well. So we'll create a loop cut in the middle and then another loop cut over here. Essentially be working with one quadrant and then mirroring that along the X and the Y axis. So let's go into face selection, shift select these faces and then X and then faces. Let's add a mirror modifier, Y and X. Let's select this edge and right click, bevel vertices. While the command is active, if you scroll up, it's going to give us more subdivisions. So we want 3 subdivisions. So here at the bottom, we can recall the previous command and adjust it. So if you want to, we can change the width here to 1 meter. Now I did not check whether our object scale is 1 because if it's not this bevel, we have an impact. So it's not. So let's undo the bevel, go back into object mode, Control A, apply scale. Let's right click again, bevel vertices, and let's type 1. And that should be much better now. We want to add some subdivisions both in here and in here, and we'll use the same sort of grid that we set up for our curtain wall. I select these 2 vertices here, and then right click, subdivide, and let's try 10. That may be too much. Let's try 9. So that feels about right. So we can measure the precise distance with the measure tool. If I click on it, hold Control, and we can see that's 600 mil. So we can go smaller, but that's quite a good size for a window. Curtain walls at storefronts and at ground levels, they do tend to have bigger pieces, whereas up higher, the scale is different. So we want to respect that more intimate scale. Okay, so shift select to select these 2 vertices, to select the whole edge, right click and subdivide. Undo that because I couldn't see it. Right click, subdivide. Let's see what works well here and looks about the same size. Next, let's select the whole edge. Go back into vertex and shift deselect this edge. So now we only have these vertices here selected. E for extrude, Z, let's type 0.7. And then E for extrude, Z, and this time 2.3. So these are going to be the glass panes and these are going to be metal panels. Apply. So you can select all of these really easily by Alt and then clicking on a face, and that selects a whole loop selection. Now we can do the same with an edge. If we deselect everything and Alt click, and we select the whole edge loop, and Alt click in the other direction, and it does something quite similar. Okay, so now let's go back into face selection. So pressing 3, Alt click to select these faces. We're going to add a default material slot and then another material slot. And in this one, we want to say glass and assign. Let's add a third material slot. We'll create a new material and we'll say facade metal. Alt select to select the bottom face and assign. Give it a color just so we know what we're doing here. Now for some reason the mirror, I must have done it at some point. Oh yes, when we're changing the scale. So let's add the mirror modifier again. We add an array modifier and change the factor x to 0 and z to 1 and add a couple. And now we have our tower pretty much. It needs a couple of things, but that's okay because we have the structure in there. So now we can go ahead and just on that quarter modify as much as we want. So let's do precisely that now. So into edit mode, and we want to select that. So within the array, or all the modifiers, by the way, we have a third icon, which is this one over here. So we can disable the modifier to display only in edit mode, right? Because if you notice this icon here looks exactly the same as the edit mode icon. If we uncheck that, we don't see the array when we're in edit mode. But now if we go into object mode, so pressing tab, we see the whole element again. Now in here, let's add a core. And the easiest way to do this is to Shift D to duplicate this vertex, and then hold X and move it along, then E to extrude, and then Y to move, E for extrude again, and I'm gonna press and hold Control and snap because I have my vertex snapping set up. So when I press and hold Control, it temporarily enables the snaps. Next, let's select these two edges here, and then E for extrude, Z. And if we press and hold Control again, we should be able to snap to one of these vertices here. Great. Next, let's add a wireframe modifier. So add, oh, it's not showing up. There it is, wireframe. I got scared. I thought my wireframe modifier is gone. And that's okay, but it's not what we're looking for because we don't want it to be everywhere. So what we can do is specify a vertex group to get the wireframe modifier, and that vertex group is going to be only the facade. So if we go back into edit mode, the first thing we want to do is select face, and if we try to move this face now, you see it's selected to the edges. However, if we right click and choose split, and now with G, if we try to move it, you see it's not selected to the edges anymore. What we've done is separated that geometry. It's still within the same object, but the beauty about meshes is that the object can hold multiple separate elements. And that's quite different than NURBS for Rhino, an example, where the only way of an object to exist is to have a connecting edge with another object. So if I'm over an object that I want to select and I press L, it selects everything that's linked. And here we have different types of links that we can select. So we can delimit only the material, for example. So it selects only elements that are the same material, or in this case, seam. Next, let's go to the object data properties, and under vertex group, add a new slot and press assign. And let's call this facade. So what are vertex groups? They're essentially saved selections. So if I select now, you can see we select all those vertex groups here. Now, if the bottom face wasn't separated, those vertices along that edge would have also been connected. So we would have had part of that selection being available there, which we don't want at the moment. And the cool thing is that these groups, these saved selections, these vertex groups can be used in many different ways across Blender, especially in modifiers. So if we go back to the modifier tab now, and under wireframe, expand vertex group, and we should get a drop down of all the available vertex groups for this particular object. And in this case, we only have one, so let's select it. And now let's see what the effect is by checking replace original again. And we need to exit out of edit mode. Actually, replace original doesn't respect the vertex group, so that's all right. But if we go in there and check what we have, we notice that we only have vertex groups for our facade, which is exactly what we want. Now let's continue to refine our object here. So we want to add a few columns. So the easiest way to add columns is to select this edge, shift click. I'm going to deselect this vertex here. And now if you go into edit, mesh tools, edge tools, and we have a command called offset edges. Mesh tools is an add-on that needs to be enabled. So if you go into edit, preferences, add-ons, and you look for mesh tools, and make sure you enable it. Okay, so once you enable it, if you haven't had it enabled, so go to edit, mesh tools, edge tools, offset edges. Now you might not see anything because they may have offset in the wrong direction. We can click this icon here. And by the way, you definitely want to expand the previous command pop-up. So click on over here. And we sort of get offset edges somewhere along this edge, which is perfectly fine. Maybe we want it to slightly further in. So let's try 0.3. That works well. So this is going to be the line that we're going to use for our columns. So let's go ahead and create a couple more materials here. So first we want to create a material called floor. Let's add a new material called walls. And again, give them some sort of material, even though we're not completely changing them yet. Oh, actually the first one should be floor. So we can select the first lot. And in here, we can actually choose pre-made materials already. We don't always need to make a new one. And select floor. I'm going to move this slot down. So we have walls. Let's select these two faces here. Click on walls and press assign. And let's just change the color so we can see them better. And this, I'm going to get rid of it because watch, if I change the name of it, this one changes as well because it is the same material. So let's erase, get rid of it, create a new one. And we'll call this one columns. Now I want to move the glass all the way down with the slots and facade metal all the way down. And we're going to have some ceiling materials there as well. So we're not quite done here yet. But what we want to do is add another slot and find our frame material. So this is to have the correct offset for our frame for the wireframe, if you remember from the curtain wall example below. Let's add our columns. So first we want to go to vertex selection and then Shift A, cube locker. And we want to use circle and cylinder. And there's a lot of options here, right? It could be a bit overwhelming, but if you spend the time to just read them a little bit, we can snap to things. So snapping while the command is active, if you press Y. Okay, so there's a slight error that I need to fix, and that is that the cube locker add-on only works with faces, and these are not faces. So we'll just need to temporarily create faces again. So I'm going to go into edge selection, Alt click, X, vertices, select this edge here, go into vertex selection, shift deselect this vertex, offset edges again, and this time we want to change from offset to extrude. So we're making these sort of fake faces for the time being that we're going to erase later, but we want to use them as snapping helpers. So now Shift A, cube locker, circle and cylinder. I need to hide this. So Shift A, cube locker, circle and cylinder. Press Y for the snaps. And now we can actually snap to our elements here. Now they may not snap too well, but that's all right because we can get a little bit closer. Now if you press Shift while dragging, we can make this about the size that we want it to be. And then click again and extrude. And then if we press Y, we can snap to the top. And now we need to click again. And now we have our column. L to select the whole column. And we want to quickly assign this to columns. Assign, change the color just so we can see it better. And I'm going to get rid of the top face. So let's get rid of this face, X face. And let's get rid of this face, X face. Okay, so now with our column ready, we can move it around. So L to select, and let's start moving it here. Now I'm going to do Shift D to duplicate, and then X. Let's move it somewhere over here. Shift D to duplicate, and let's put it somewhere in the corner. Then I'm going to go to top view here, and then Shift D to somewhere over here. and then Shift D for the last one, somewhere over here. So now let's take a look. So probably this one is a bit too much. So X faces, and then L to select this element here. And we want to make the spacing as even as we can. Now, in this case, it might be slightly different because I prefer aesthetically for the facade to be aligned to the curtain wall. The columns to be aligned to the curtain wall, or the other way around, the curtain wall to be aligned to the columns. Let's go into edge selection, and then Alt click, and then X vertices to delete that helper grid that we created for ourselves. So that's what our building looks like right now. So the only other thing we're going to add in terms of our little quadrant over here is a ceiling. To do that, let's go into face selection mode. Shift D to select this Z, and then hold Control to snap. Now I'm going to delete this vertex here for a second. X verts. And in fact, before we do that, let's actually move everything up 1 meter. So G, Z, 1. The reason being is because these vertices will be on the exact same position, and it may be a little bit hard to pick up which one is which. Okay, now let's get rid of this vertex. X verts, select everything by holding L, and then offset edges. Let's change the width to 0.05 or 0.1. Select offset edges again. And now we can change the angle actually, which is really nice. So we can change that to 45, maybe less, 30. And let's change the width to 0.25. And then offset edges again. Angle should be 0. And let's make this width 0.2. Now let's extrude this up. So E for extrude, Z. Let's type 0.1. Now, if we don't like something, for example, maybe I want this to be a smooth transition from all the way on the top to all the way to the bottom. If we alt click here, we're selecting this whole edge loop. And if we go to X and in the delete menu, that's a mouthful, in the delete menu, all the way down, we have an option to delete edge loops. So if we click on that, now that edge loop is gone, but everything else is there. So it's a really nice way to kind of non-destructively remove some elements, but maintain all the topology correctly. So let's select the edge again, extrude, or rather offset edges. And 0.2 is quite all right. And now we want to do something over here. We want to select this vertex, basically all these 4, and right click, merge vertices at center. What we want to do here is insert a typical grid, a ceiling grid. So if I click and hold this, and hold Control to snap it along this edge, and then click Control to snap it along this edge. Okay, so now we want to create a grid for our ceiling. So to do that, select this vertex, Control click to select this vertex here. And now we're going to extrude this a bunch of times. So E for extrude, Y, and hold Control to snap. E, Y, Control, E, Y, E, Y, E, Y, E, Y. Now we have a grid that we can use for our advantage. There's only one more thing that we need to fix now, and it's all these vertices that are overlapping. So if we L to select linked, right click, merge vertices by distance, and that should remove 7 vertices. So it's all these that are selected. To check, let's go to face selection, click on one of these faces here and move it around. And if everything around it responds correctly, then we did a proper job. Now, if you want, you can go ahead and try to fix the one that's slightly off. So this edge here is slightly off, but in my case, it doesn't really bother me too much, or maybe it's fairly easy actually. We can just move this somewhere along here. Okay, cool. So now we have the edge, and now we have our grid over here. What we want to do is create some new materials. Our material list is getting long here, but it is a building that we're trying to do in a very small chunk. So first, let's create a new material, call it ceiling edge. Let's create a new material slot again. And let's call that ceiling panels and ceiling frame. So the ceiling edge is going to be everything in the edge. So let's start selecting now. Go to face selection, Alt click, Shift Alt click, Shift Alt click. So we have these 3 edge loops here. Assign ceiling edge. Next, to select all of this, the easiest way to do it is to select links. So if you go to select similar, and there's an option called coplanar. So that automatically selects all of these elements here. So with that selected, let's move this to ceiling frame. Let's change the color to something dark and purple. And now we're going to inset all these faces to create our panels. So we use this command inset, and we want to go to the 2 options and check individual. So now we'll start insetting. And again, we want to adjust a couple of settings here. So the thickness, we want to keep it fairly small. So 0.01. And then we want to add some depth. So that's going to move these up or down. So 0.02. And we actually want it, or do we? Is that the right way? Yeah, that's the right way. Yeah, the panels are always a little bit lower than the frame. There's all kinds of different options, but let's go with this one now. Okay, so now these are all selected. So let's go ahead now and say ceiling panels. And as you can see, our object has a mysterious gap in the building and it's magically hovering. And the reason for that is because all of this is hovering. So let's select everything, L, and now let's move it down to somewhere over here. And what we need to do with the snaps, they're a bit finicky the way they work, but if we get one of these vertices to be the closest, if we try it now and hold Control, it should snap to the appropriate one. Okay, cool. So now we have our ceiling done in there as well. And again, this is quite easy to change because we can go ahead and with our array here, we can change the count. And in fact, what we want to do is put wireframe before the array. And I think that should make it a bit snappier. Okay, so now with the tower, what we want to do is create a top and a bottom. Okay, so now that we have our middle of the tower completely ready, we're ready to move on to the tower ends. So let's expand our tower. And by the way, I organized my file a little bit better. So what I did is just put everything in its correct collection. So we have one for the tower, we have one for the ground, and then we have one for the context, and then we have setups. Now let's duplicate this object. So Shift D and then escape. And it's really important to keep our top and bottom at the exact same position in regards to the origin point as our floor typical. Now let's rename this floor top. Let's hide the typical floor. And on the floor top, if we go to the modifiers, let's get rid of the array modifier. And now all we want is just the green part. We're going to erase everything else. So if we go into edit mode, go into the material properties, Alt A to deselect everything. And the material is called facade metal. So select that. And then Control I to inverse, X faces. Next, let's bring this loop cut up higher. So Alt click to click and select it with edge selection enabled. And let's just drag this up. I think I have the whole loop cut. So what we need to do then is Alt A to deselect, Alt click again. That's interesting. So I can actually show you what this does. So we have our top loop cut selected. If I Alt plus click again, it actually selects a bigger loop cut, which as you can see takes into account the sides and the bottom as well. So let's deselect everything, Alt click, and then move this up as high as we want. Now a couple of things here. We're going to bisect this. So essentially we're going to create an angle that's almost the opposite of this angle over here. But to do that, we're going to need to apply the mirror modifier. So on the mirror, we click on this arrow here where we have more options and we want to click apply. So now if we go into edit mode, you see it's all part of one object, not just the quadrant, but the whole element. Okay, so now let's go into the front view, select everything, A to click and select, and then in the toolbar, let's choose the knife tool and click and hold it to select the bisect tool. Now click and hold to draw a plane. So something along these lines here. In fact, I want to drag my plane down, and we can't really rotate it. I don't know why, but we can rotate it by changing the plane normal here. So if you don't see this menu, just make sure you expand it. And I think if I change this, the normal X, you see it sort of changes. So we can make it sharper or thinner. Okay, so I'm quite happy with that. And then there's another interesting option. So if you click on clear inner, it clears the top elements. And now if we click on fill, it automatically fills that for us. And that's exactly what we want. So now with the face selected, press I to inset and type 0.2 and then E for extrude. And we can do 0.5 in the negative direction. In fact, that may be too much, so I'm going to delete that. So backspace and type in -0.2. The last thing that we want to do is assign a specific vertex group just for our faces again, just so we have a wireframe modifier that goes all the way up, but not all the way around. So let's go to the object data settings. And first, let's see what's selected. So click on select, and actually everything is part of the vertex group now. Click remove, Alt-A to deselect everything, going to face selection, Alt-click to select this face loop, and assign. Alt-A to deselect, and now if you click on select, we have the correct faces showing. So they're part of that group, which means the wireframe is only going to work on that specific group. So we can hide our floor top for now, and let's show floor typical once again. Click on it, expand the array modifier, expand the subtab called caps, and at cap end, we want to choose floor top, and that magically appears. So if we change the number of arrays, we always have that specific element as the cap. Now, a couple of things to note. The material indices need to stay the same. If we go to the floor top, for example, and even though we are only using one material and we want to get rid of some of the other ones, if we start erasing them, the material indices get screwed up. It's really important to start with your base model and then duplicate that. Don't erase any of the materials, edit your elements, and then use that as the array cap or bottom. So I'm going to undo that, hide our floor top again, and we have our element more or less done. Duplicate this object, show it again, Shift D. If we try to click on Shift D here, it doesn't duplicate. The reason for that is that commands are sensitive to where the cursor is currently located. My cursor is here, so this is the active window. If my cursor is now here, this is the active window. And Shift D only works in the viewport, so I have to be in the viewport and then Shift D, and that works. So press escape to leave it where it is. Rename this to floor bottom. Hide floor top, hide floor typical, and with floor bottom selected, let's go into edit mode. We want to erase everything again except these faces. So Control I and then X faces. With everything selected, let's go into front view or rear view in this case, and we want to scale this, so we'll do this slightly different. Let's enable X-ray, scale this down, and because there's an angle, we can use that to scale our elements. So it doesn't need to be completely correct because we'll hide this within the thickness of the ground roof, but that looks about good. Now, I accidentally did this in object mode, and the difference between doing this in object mode and edit mode is that this gets distorted, which means that our frame kind of gets stretched. So let's apply this, Control A, and then apply scale. And now you see the frame sort of changed into the correct thickness. And the other thing is, because we scale with negatives, it's good to make sure that our normals are facing the right direction. To enable our normals, if we click on the viewport overlays, and all the way on the bottom, there is something called face orientation. And blue means that it's facing the correct way, red means it's facing the incorrect way, or it's not correct or incorrect. One is facing forwards and the other one is facing backwards. So with all of our geometry selected, if you go to face, or rather mesh, normals, and we want to, it doesn't matter which one we choose, we can say we calculate it outside or flip. And if we flip it, now they're showing up in the correct way. So we can disable the overlay now. So as you notice, there's quite a few more overlay options when we're in edit mode. But face orientation should hopefully stay in the same position. Everything else is information that's moved further down. Now this object, we won't do as a cap to the bottom of our array because our array is basically staying in the same place. So we can keep this as is and enable floor typical. And now I'm also noticing that I have floor top disabled in the viewport, but not disabled for render time, which means it will render out. So let's uncheck that. And we have to fix our overlapping geometry here. So if you go into floor bottom again, go into edit mode, Alt A to deselect everything, Alt click the top faces. Now I have to enable X-ray thing over here, and we're in face selection. So let's get into edge selection, Alt click, let's move Z, and let's snap to the bottom of this face over here. Now Alt Z is the hotkey for enabling and disabling X-ray. Okay, and what I'm noticing is a bit of an overlap here. So what we want to do is grab our bottom and our building and just slide them slightly up until there's no more overlap. That's good. And we expanded the bottom enough so it still overlaps with our roof here. Now the only other thing that I would like to do is add a few lights within our ceiling. So let's click on floor typical, tab to go into edit mode, deselect everything. Now we're going to select a few faces here. So let's go to face selection. We're going to turn into ceiling panels. And within the mirror modifier, there's a nifty option on cage, which if we click on it, it shows us the selection on all the mirrored faces as well. So that's quite nice just to understand exactly which faces they are and how well our grid is distributed. So I'm also going to change the ceiling material. Yeah, so these are ceiling panels, and let's just change the viewport display so it's easier to see what's selected. Okay, so that's a bit better. And now let's select a few of these faces. And what we want to do is match the distribution. I'm just clicking here with Shift and Shift deselecting. So I just have Shift permanently held at the moment. So we want this face. So yeah, I think we'll skip by 2. So that looks nice on one side. Now on the other, we won't probably be able to get it to look right, because we either have 2 or we have 1. Perhaps we can have 2 at the end. And 1 over here. That looks all right. It's not the best grid. It's not the worst either. Or maybe like this. Yeah, that works. So let's add 2 more lights. These are going to be our lights. Let's create a new material. Plus for a new material slot. Create a new material. And let's call this ceiling light frames. So with these elements selected, I to inset. So we'll inset slightly. We're going to extrude a little bit, but I want to go in a front view just to make sure we don't extrude too much, and enable X-ray again. And this is one of those situations where it can be useful to have 2 views. So let's create a new one really quickly. Click and hold this corner and it creates a new window. By default, it creates the same kind of window that we had in that place before. And if you accidentally have way too many, remember you can always right click in the area between 2 windows and choose join areas. Now I'm going to hide my sidebar and toolbar, T for toolbar and for sidebar. And just click, so we see what we're doing in both a perspective view and a side view. I to inset again, and this time we're going to change the depth in there as well. I want to go slightly positive. And then I to inset one last time and change the depth once again. And these last faces here, they're going to be our lights. So let's create a new material again and call this ceiling lights. Let's make him yellow. Now I'm going to close this view again and press assign. Now I realized I forgot to make the selection of the previous faces. I made the material, but I forgot to press assign, which is good because I can show you another tool. Instead of manually going and selecting everything, if we go to select, select more or less, select more, select more or less, more, and once more, select more or less, more, and now we have our selection without having to manually go and select all of these faces. And at this point we don't have too many faces, but you can imagine if you have a more complex model, this saves quite a bit of time of manual selection. We don't want the red faces. With ceiling light selected, press deselect. It's a little bit hard to see, but now if we select a new material, ceiling light frames, and press assign, you see the yellow doesn't change. What we did is we selected all that and we deselected the faces that just had that material on. So now we have just these with the correct material. Again, let's give it some sort of funky color. Now if we go around, we have a ceiling grid. Cool, okay, so the modeling is done with the building. Now it's time to move on to adding a little bit more details on our ground. We're approaching the end of our modeling here. The only thing left is to add a few more details on the ground, because right now it's a big, huge empty space. So what we're going to do is add a few walls, add some doors in the curtain wall, and add some art. So let's start with the walls. The first thing I want to do is turn off our building on top. Go to top view. And by the way, we need to make sure the cursor is snapped somewhere on the ground level, which it appears to be right now. If it's not, we can just position it. Now let's go to top view, Shift A to add mesh plane. Now we need to enable X-ray mode here. Go into edit mode, go to edge selection. So I'm pressing to my keyboard and let's select this edge and erase it. X and then edges. Next, let's duplicate this edge, Shift D, go to the original and erase it. X edges. Now let's go to vertex selection mode and make sure we are on select box tool. Select these two vertices and move them up and press Ctrl while moving them up to snap them to somewhere over here. And let's move these vertices quite close to the ground. Next, let's go into edge mode. I'm just going to slide this one over to somewhere over here and slide this over to here. Now let's go into vertex selection mode again. And we can drag that somewhere further out. We can keep these in the same position. Let's move this one to over here. So I'm control snapping, select both, right click, merge by distance. We have a notification that we removed one vertex. E for extrude a vertex, then snap with Y, and then E to extrude the vertex again, and snap with X. And now we have our walls in here. So the idea is that this here serves as the building entrance. So in here we will have our core and some back of house functions. This here serves as our reception area for the gallery. So we'll put a desk somewhere over here. And then there's an entrance from the gallery to the reception area in here. And here we'll put on some art, which we'll find from Sketchfab. So we'll have maybe some sculptures, some Japanese shobi screen. So we can go further and define the interior walls, but at this point, because we're more concerned about how the image of our concept looks instead of showing floor plans, we won't worry about modeling what we don't see in our views. Let's select everything, A, and then E for extrude and Z. If we want to go beyond our boundaries, because we use Boolean in the same way that we used for the curtain wall. So now go into object mode, let's disable X-ray. Go to modifiers, add a modifier. Solidify, change the offset to 0 so it offsets on both sides, and change the thickness to 0.1. Next, let's add a boolean, and we want to use roof boolean, roof bool. If we click on fast, it actually does a better job with this kind of model than the exact one. I'm really happy there's two, by the way. That's our wall. So the only thing we want to do is create some sort of opening here between the two. In edit mode, I'm going to isolate the object, /. Turn on the solidify modifier in edit mode so we see what we're doing a little bit better, and let's use our loop cut tool from the toolbar. We want a loop cut here, so click and hold, another one here, and then one over here. Next, let's get rid of this face, X faces. Let's go to edge selection, select this edge, and it's a little bit high right now, so let's make it a bit lower at 3 meters. Still quite grand, but that's quite all right. And now we have our walls complete. Let's fill up our space here with some art. So we're going to use Sketchfab for that. And Sketchfab also has a nifty plugin that works directly with Blender. To search for it, you can Google Sketchfab Blender add-on and you get to this place. On GitHub, you have to go to code, download zip. Once you've downloaded the zip file, go to your preferences and then install, and that will get the pop-up view, and you select your zip file from your downloads folder. And then it should automatically select it. Press selection to enable it, and then you should see a new tab in your sidebar called Sketchfab. We need to activate the add-on, and I'm already logged in, but if you're not, you probably have to put in your username. So Sketchfab does require for you to sign up on their address, but it's quite useful, so I highly recommend it. And then we can either search directly in here. Let's search for Japanese screen to see what we get. So we get these. That's the one we want to use. However, what I prefer to do is actually search online, and I've put up a few art pieces that I like, and that's what's great about Sketchfab. A lot of museums scan a lot of their sculptures or their artwork, and they put it on here for free, many times with the ability to download. Let's try to find this. By the way, we can download the GLTF, and then that loads directly within Blender. However, in this case, let's use the add-on. This is one thing that I definitely want to have in here, but first let's create a new collection. So underground, create a new collection, and let's call it art. Make it the active one, and now import model. It's going to take a few minutes to think about what it's doing, and now it's imported. If you go to material preview, we should be able to see the actual material, and they usually come in really well. They come in really nicely. This object has a parent, so what we need to do is select the parent, which is this empty little symbol. That's called an empty in Blender. And if we remove that, it moves all the objects. So let's go to item, rotation. We need to change this to XYZ Euler and change the Z rotation to 180 degrees. So what we can do is simply move just the objects, not the empty, but just the objects up. We can snap. Now the snap's a little bit tricky, right? So what I did is move this up without snapping first, because snaps usually work with whatever vertex is closest to it. And now if I move and hold Control, then it snapped to the right place. And let's move them out a little bit further. And now we know that if we put this empty at 0 in the Z axis, this will be in the right place. Now that screen is huge, so let's scale it down, S. And to start seeing what we're doing, let's add a material for our glass. Click on the curtain wall, go to the Materials tab, Glass, Expand Surface, and we see this huge list of options, which, as you know by now, is the same as the options here in the shader editor. So this is a separate window, and we can change from timeline to shader editor to enable it. If we change the color here, it changes it there as well. Let's change the alpha down, change transmission to 1, and then what we need to do is go into settings, blend mode, change to alpha hashed, shadow, none. Or we can use alpha blend for the shading mode, for the blend mode. That should work just as well. So now our glass is transparent. Let's change the roughness down to 0, because glass is reflective. Go back to our object. It has a Chinese name. Let's call it screen. And the whole collection can be called screen, or don't need that collection. So let's click all 3 objects and drag them in art. And we can delete this collection. So click the screen again. We can position this as we see fit. I'm going to put my cursor over here and see if we can import some other objects. So the other object that I liked is this golden deer. It's very nice. Let's search for it directly within Sketchfab. Golden deer. And here it is, golden deer. Import model. It's going to take a minute for the settings, the materials to load. Let's take a look. It's really nice. I think there's some sort of issue here with the normals. Let's check how it looks here, whether it's meant to be that way or not. And it isn't. So we need to change a few settings. So if we select our object, right click, shade smooth, and then auto smooth, and change the angle to something small like 2. Oh, that's different. We can keep it as triangulated as well. Or we actually make it larger, so maybe like 60. Let's go in edit mode and see what's going on here. These are sharp edges because the mesh hasn't been joined together. So what we can do is select everything, A, and then right click. We need to be in vertex selection, or we can just choose the vertex menu here. So select everything, go to mesh, merge by distance. And that removed quite a few vertices. There was a lot of duplicate information there for some reason, but now it's much nicer, much smoother. So triangulated by the import. And there's an option called tries to quads. So that can really easily clean it up for us. We don't even need to use auto smooth because everything will be smooth by default. So that's much better. However, I quite like the triangulated work. So let's see what we can do. So first we'll add a modifier called decimate. And what decimate does is it reduces the amount of faces. Our current face count is 1608. Let's try 0.6. Our face count has been reduced. And by the nature of the way that the decimate modifier works, it means that everything is sort of triangulated, right? The mesh is not as clean, the topology. So now if we shade it flat, let's see what happens. We sort of get this kind of look. So if we decimate it even more, you can see we have a pretty cool sculpture. If we want to make sure that we have triangles everywhere, we can also go and add a different modifier called triangulate. And now we're guaranteed to have triangles everywhere. Or there's actually an option called triangulate within the decimate modifier, so it automatically triangulates it for us. And we can keep on pushing this to get a different kind of look. Somewhere around 0.5 is quite nice. Cool, so that's a pretty nice statue. R and then Z to rotate. Now let's go back to the Sketchfab websites, and I have a couple more things. So we already loaded this. We loaded this. So I thought this could look nice. So it's called Statue of Justice. So let's look for Statue of Justice. And I'm going to place the cursor somewhere over here. Statue of Justice. So there are quite a few. And here's the one that we want. Import model. This one's quite big actually, 43 megabytes. Here it is. So Statue of Justice. It seems that by default, all of these get their own collections. That's okay. We can drag all these back into our art. If it is just an object, I can erase the actual collections and drag the objects within the art gallery and get rid of the empty collections. Let's scale him down maybe 0.1. That seems to be about the right size. Now I'm going to drag him up and out. Move him somewhere over here. And now drag and hold Control, and we should be able to snap to one of these vertices over here. And we have a slight gap, so let's move him slightly lower. We can move our screen further back, so we give a bit more space. And a classic, so let's get this. So the Great Wave. I'm just going to copy the name. Let's search again in here. Oh, actually, we have that in a couple of different ways. So we can choose whichever one we like. Let's go with this one, which is 15 megabytes. And we're going to put it on this wall over here. Now, this one is taking a while to load. It may be due to the internet connection as well. Okay, it's finally loaded. It's huge, so we need to shrink it again. And let's see how this is organized. So that's a lot of objects. In this case, we don't need these. And I imagine it's because they've actually done it in 3D, which is pretty cool. So there's a couple of different objects. So there's a real big sense of depth here. However, we don't need any of that. So shift click, select them all, go in the viewport, Control J to join it into a single object. I'm going to drag this into the art gallery. And what we want is with this object to clear the parent, because we have the same sort of setup. We can do that in a couple of different ways. So one way is to go to the object properties, relations, and here it tells us who the parent is. Also, we can click on here with the object selected in the object menu on top, parent, and then we have an option to say clear parent, keep, transform. It does the exact same thing, that's not here, and we see the hierarchy within the outliner also changed. Now let's rename our walls, put them in the ground collection, and we can erase this, delete hierarchy. There's two options when we delete a collection. There's delete and delete hierarchy. Delete deletes only the collection but not the objects within it. Delete hierarchy deletes the collection and all the objects contained within it. Let's scale this to 0.1, S.1, S.1 again. It must be modeled in millimeters. Drag this, get it to about the correct position. And now let's zoom. It's not really in the correct position, is it? Let's go to top view, G to move it here. And then let's go to front view, G to move it somewhere over here. And now we're in the right place. So let's go and rotate our object. I like to use this XYZ ruler. Let's change this to 90. And now click and hold and then drag. And we should be able to snap. So let's make this larger. Sometimes this happens where we lose our place and we can't zoom in. So with our object selected, if you click on the asterisk key, and then there's an option view selected. This opening is looking a bit too big. So let's click on the wall, edit mode. And let's drag this in a little bit to something like that. And let's move our painting slightly off. The gallery is nearly complete. So let's get this statue now over here and put it on the other side. If we go to top view, toggle X-ray. X-ray, by the way, doesn't work with material preview mode. It works, but only if you're editing in edit mode. In object mode, it doesn't work. Alt D to create a duplicate linked, and then R to rotate. Do something along these lines. Let's move him slightly closer. And by the way, we can click on these rectangles here as well. And if we click on it, we can move our object within that plane. So it's locked to two axes. So the blue one is the ground plane. Next on the list, let's add some doors. Start with a plane. Shift A, add mesh plane. And it's added where our cursor is, which currently is located there. Next, let's go into edit mode. Control R to put a loop cut, then click and then escape so it stays in the middle. Control I to select everything else. XE for edge, select our edge, and then E for extrude, and then Z. Let's move this plane to be close to where our wall is. Doesn't need to be exact, but somewhere along here. Go into edit mode, select everything, Shift D to duplicate in edit mode. So that's important because this is actually one and the same object. This opening is 2 meters, which is too wide for a door. So let's make it 0.9 by moving this edge 1.1 meters. That's pretty much about the size of our threshold here. So let's go ahead and do the same here. 1.1. And now face selection. It's a little bit bigger, slightly bigger. Well, in that case, it would look a little bit funny if it's this size, so let's make it much larger. So now I'm scaling it to make it look good within the concept, within the curtain wall, then worrying about making it completely the right size. Let's call this object doors, and that shouldn't be in the art gallery. So click on the ground. Let's minimize the art collection. So doors. Now create a link to duplicate. So Alt D and then escape to keep it in the same place. And let's call this doors boolean. Doors bool. The doors boolean we're going to use to create boxes that are extruding from the curtain wall. But they're sharing the same geometry. So if we move our doors, the boolean boxes will also get updated. So with doors bool selected, add a modifier, solidify, offset, change to 0, thickness 0.5. Now we should have two boxes. With doors bool, in edit mode, I have bool tool enabled, which comes with Blender. So make sure you enable it. So first click our door boolean, then click the curtain wall. And we want to go to brush boolean difference. Next, within the curtain wall modifier stack, we want this new boolean that we created to be before the wireframe. So click and hold and drag it so it's on top of the wireframe. We can get something pretty funky. Kind of looks like this. So let's change from exact to fast. And now it should come out okay. Let's select our doors here again. Create a new material. Or rather, instead of creating new material, let's just select our glass. Add a new slot. Select frame. And let's adjust our frame material now here. So all we need to do is create metallic and change the color so it's slightly darker. So with doors modifiers, add a modifier, wireframe modifier, uncheck replace original, and material offset, we want to make sure that the offset for the wireframe is 1. And the thickness, let's make it 0.04. So now we have our doors. Now the cool thing about this setup is if we go to doors and we decide that we want something different, maybe this one should be made of 2 panels. Maybe both of them actually should be made of 2 panels. So we can really quickly add a loop cut. So I'm using Control R on both of them. And if we go and change it, the boolean is still there, but now we have a wireframe. And if we want to, for some reason, say that we want to adjust this wall to be this wide, if we do it in edit mode, we don't see the update, but if we exit out of edit mode and go into object mode, all of a sudden our door has been updated. So Control Z to undo that. Control Z again. We need some desks now for our receptionists. So to get desks, we can either search Sketchfab. So let's see what they have. Desk. So we can have something rustic and classic looking, or some sort of low poly with all kinds of stuff in it. Or we can also check out Blender Kit. So Blender Kit again is a free add-on that comes with Blender. You do need to create a login for it. And once you've logged in, you can search here. Or there's also a menu that pops up there, which I disable. And you can disable it as well in the preferences. So if I go to preferences, search for Blender Kit, expand it. And there's an option, show Blender Kit search in 3D view header. So I uncheck that so it doesn't show up here. So now let's search for desk. And I'm in materials, so I need to be in models. Let's search for desk. Okay, so these look a little bit better. Again, not quite reception desk-like. The reception desks are usually closed on one side. And then all the other ones are paid. This one is pretty cool. Okay, so let's use it. So I'm gonna click and drag it. And for now, we can just position it here. So the desk is now loaded. And let's see where the structure is. Actually, the structure is the same as the one we have in Sketchfab. We have an empty and then all the objects are parented to it. What we'll just do is put this in its position. So somewhere over here, minus 90. Okay, so we want to duplicate the whole thing. We would need to do in this case, because there's objects and parents and things, it gets quite complicated. Click on the collection and duplicate collection. Now let's drag the duplicate over here. And we need a chair. So let's look for a chair in Blender Kit. Chair. Now we just want the lowest resi chair. And you can tell here it tells us this is 5 megabytes. This one is 32 megabytes, 25 megabytes. Oh, there's actually an option, now that I remember, to limit the file size. So in Blender Kit, expand search filters, file size. And let's change the maximum to 20. Let's see which models are less than 20 megabytes big. Hey, we want to be careful with all these assets, because the bigger they are, the more memory they take and the longer time it takes to move around the viewport and eventually render. So this one is 4 megabytes. It's not the prettiest of chair though. And this one is 5 megabytes. Let's use this one. So I'm clicking and dragging. So let's move over here. Okay, the chair has been loaded. So I'm going to select the empty that it came with and position it somewhere over here. Then RZ90 minus, and then RZ. So it should be slightly off axis, maybe something like this. And then duplicate again. And I duplicated mine already. So let's put him over there. Last bit of detail that helps is putting a laptop on there. So I'm going to position the cursor. By the way, we can position the cursor here, or shift right clicking also positions the cursor in different place. So let's type in laptop, and the results are not coming up. There they are, laptop, and let's drag it in. And I think by default it puts it where the cursor is, although it seems to also pick up the orientation of the cursor. So our ground floor is complete, and now it's time to move on to assigning some basic materials in the next video. Let's start adding some materials. So first let's go to our typical floor, click on it, go to the material tab. Let's make this a little bit bigger now because we have quite a few to cover, and we'll start with the floor. So click on floor. Let's expand our shader editor. In case you don't have a shader editor, make sure you switch to a shader editor type. We'll give it a dark color. Something along these lines here, because floors are typically a bit darker. Next, let's move on to walls. So walls are going to be also a little bit darker. And if you remember from way in the beginning when we created the materials for our floor, we'll use that same group that we created with the noise. So Shift A in the shader editor, group, noise. And let's plug that in. What that would do is give us a bit of variety of the wall texture, right? So we will add a bit of noise for variation purposes. So when we zoom in, you can sort of see what it looks like. And we can change the factors or the scale, but I think this looks quite all right. Now what we will do though is use that same texture to plug it into the roughness and into the normal. So let's plug that into roughness, and it's going to take a minute to recalculate. And for the normal, we'll need to add a node called bump. So Shift A, search, bump, plug in the color into height, and plug the normal into normal. That's very textured now, maybe a bit too textured. So what we need to do is turn down the strength and the distance. But if you notice, all of these are different colors. So the gray ones are just a single value. The yellow ones are an RGB value. The blue ones are an XYZ value. So 3 values in one. So strength, let's turn that to 0.1, distance 0.1. Something quite subtle. Okay, so that's pretty good. Columns could actually use the same material that we have for the wall. So we can change this to, and let's search for it, walls. Next, facade metal. So what we'll do here is we use this setup from the walls for a lot of the other things. So let's copy everything. So select everything, Control C. Go to facade metal, delete this, Control V. So now we have the same base, and let's start to adjust it. First, we want to make everything metallic, and it's going to take a minute to think about what it wants to do. And you can see that already looks quite nice. Maybe we want to change this size of the scale a little bit, and maybe make this a little bit darker. And when we make it darker, it's going to make it by nature shinier because we've plugged this in to roughness. The smaller the value of roughness, the shinier the object is. Let's play a little bit with the scale. See if we can get something that looks quite nice. Oh, actually, I'm playing with the factors. So here's the scale. That's so minimal that we can barely see it. So let's continue down the list. Facade metal, frame. So for the frame, we're going to use the same material setup. So once again, let's Control C this and go to frame. Delete, Control V. And now we should have a similar thing. Yep, except this frame seems to be a glass frame instead of the correct frame. So we're going to have to play a little bit with the indices of the material for the frame. So let's see, what can we do? So material index offset is set to 0. So let's set it to 1. So 1 is the correct one. Now let's continue. So the glass, its material is offset to 1, which means wherever we have facade metal, so here, that's going to get the frame. So actually it's one and the same, and I'm okay with the frame being the exact same color. So what we can do is change this frame to facade metal. The ceiling edge is this element here. So we want that to be brighter. So let's make this brighter. Something here. And let's increase the screen. So we have something like that. Ceiling panels. So ceiling panels, they do tend to be quite simple and white, but we'll add our typical material layout again. So Control V. In this case, it's not metallic, and the color should be much whiter. And maybe we want to add a bit more screen. Ceiling frame, that we could actually use facade metal. So I'm going to literally select the same material. So facade metal. Next, ceiling light frames. Delete this. Control V. So metal. So let's make it or quite white, not completely white. With ceiling lights, we can get rid of this. Shift A, shader, emission. Connect this to surface. And let's change this to 3. Lights with emission, unfortunately, they only work with cycles, which is the ray tracing engine. They don't work with EV. But they still give us a sense that there is something in there that is a bit lit. Okay, so I think we forgot to add to our floor our noise pattern. So let's go ahead and do that. In fact, I'll just copy and paste our typical setup here. Turn off metallic and make it darker. And you can see how just this tiny bit of detail here has significantly improved the look of our materials. Now this is quite glossy. And again, the reason is because the dark color determines the roughness. And the roughness determines how rough the material is. So in this case, let's uncheck that and manually change it. I think 0.5 is quite a nice value there. Now for these walls, we're going to use the exact same material that we used before. So let's use the walls material again as a starting point and duplicate it. So we duplicate it by hitting either the 6, it makes a new copy, or we could have done new material. Let's call that roof. And we will have to decrease the scale here quite a bit to make this start looking right. I'm going to change the color to something darker and increase the multiply factor. And now that's very glossy. So what we want to do is increase our bump. So let's change the distance to maybe 1. Let's make it concrete. We probably want to make it a little bit lighter in that case. And we want it to be really textured concrete. We want to have that scale with the texture. So we do need the noise to be a larger number so we can read that texture better. So maybe 30. That's starting to look a bit better. And let's increase the strength 0.3. That's it. That's quite rough now, isn't it? It doesn't have as many variations. We can go ahead and add another noise modifier here to work. But I find this workflow to be fairly fast for getting an idea of the materiality of a model. Next, we need a floor that's a different material. I'm going to shift right click to put our cursor here. Shift A, mesh plane. Go into edit mode. Click one side. Drag it somewhere over here. Click the other side. We want this to start from the curtain wall. So we'll move this way out. Let's move this in. And what we'll do is we'll adjust our base. So if I click on the base, now let's go to tool and make sure correct face is on. So our UVs don't get too messed up. So we have something like this. So let's select this plane and call it ground floor. Move it to the ground collection. And now I'm going to offset it really slightly so it just sits on top of that grass. 0.01. We can do additions and divisions and all kinds of things in all these boxes. So I'm just going to put plus 0.01. Let's do the same for you. 0.01. And I actually won't worry too much about the rest. With this plane now, let's select that with plane. And let's add the floor material. Now I'm going to duplicate it. I want this to be polished concrete. Let's click to make a duplicate and say floor polished. Let's plug this back into our roughness. And let's decrease the scale so it reads a little bit larger. Something like 0.5. And also the scale here. So maybe 6. 0.12. 1.15. Let's try a scale of 2. Okay, so that started to look a little bit like polished concrete. Not completely. Again, to make really good materials takes a really long time, but just good enough to get our idea across. Let's set up a camera. So we already have a camera here. To see what the camera sees, we just click on this camera icon and we see what the camera sees, which at the moment is not very exciting. So let's exit out of the camera. And let's position this in a place where I know that I want the building to be located from the view. Go to top view and move the camera somewhere over here. Next, let's change the focal length to something about 24 millimeters. If you don't know what that does, is it basically increases the field of view. So we see more within the camera, even though it's in the same position. The angles get a little bit distorted, but that should be okay. Just going to move this plane edge a little bit further in. Let's click on the camera again and see what it's seeing. And we'll change a few things. Z, let's make that 1.7. Rotation in the X should be 90 degrees. And now we can play with the Z rotation to get our angle to look right. I want to move my camera ever so slightly, so we can do it directly within the camera. So if I move the X and rotate the Z, you can see in this way we can get quite precise. In the camera object data settings, if we shift Y, we can move our camera. Next, if we go to output properties, we can change the resolution. Default is 1920 by 1080, so HD. So let's change the Y resolution a little bit. Let's make it a square. So that's nice, but we need to shift the Y a little bit more so our whole building is well within there. And remember, we can make this building as tall as we want because it's all set up with an array. So if we want to, we can go one level higher, which of course becomes a little bit more difficult to render out, or one level lower. So I think for the time being, I'll just keep it as it was. So something like this. So that's one view. And let's set up another camera. I'm going to click on the camera so we can click on the frame, Shift D to duplicate. And to change from one camera to the other, in the outliner, if we click on the green camera icon, that will change it. So this is the active. They're at the same place right now, so there is not much of a difference. And next, let's move the camera around, but this time we'll move it in a different way. If you go to View, View Lock, Camera to View. What that does is it allows us to move the camera with the view. So we can go and move the camera any way that we want to set up our view. I find that quite fine. So then just remember to uncheck the view. And now we need to do a couple of things with this camera. So you can still see that it's a little bit distorted. So we want to change the Shift Y back to 0. And now if you move to G and then press Z, it moves along the global Z. But if you press Z again, it moves along the normal Z in a way that we like. But I actually find this way to rotate the most precise way still. And we can change the focal length now to something that's a little bit more zoomed in. Shift the Z, something like this. We keep these two cameras. So we have this view and we have this. So we're done with setting up our model for visualization purposes. In the next video, let's see how we can do renderings.